Chapter 154. Go to watch net. Su Chan's words stunned him. He really couldn't associate the title of the strongest master of the younger generation in the cultivation world with the stunning woman in front of him. Watch net. 7K. Oath M. Zi Yuan was wearing a pure white long dress. It could be said that it was classical, but it also looked very modern. If it were any other woman wearing this dress, no one would pay much attention to her. But if it was very modern, it just happened that this dress exuded an antique feeling when worn by her. It was as if there was a faint scent of sandalwood and books lingering around this woman, curling up in spirals and not dissipating. It was an antique scent, and every movement she made had a kind of indifferent and elegant aura. With every step she took, the same sentence flashed through the minds of the people around her. Wave-like micro-steps, silk socks create dust. Li Yundong couldn't help taking a step back. He was not shocked by Zi Yuan's name, but by this woman's beautiful appearance and ethereal temperament. He couldn't help thinking, this woman must be a fairy from heaven who has fallen into the mortal world. Otherwise, why didn't he have the slightest aura of the mortal world? Zi Yuan stared at Li Yundong intently. She stopped in her tracks, as if the trickling river had instantly solidified into a clear pool of water. It was cold and translucent, without any ripples, as if she had never moved at all. It was so peaceful and quiet that it made people feel peaceful and comfortable. Li Yundong. Her voice was melodious and pleasant to the ear, like the chirping of birds in the forest, which doubled the tranquil and ethereal feeling of her entire body. Although he knew that the woman in front of him was Su Chan's enemy, he was shocked to find that he couldn't feel any hostility in his heart. I am. Li Yundong looked at Zi Yuan warily. He leaned slightly to the side and protected Su Chan behind him. What do you want from me? Zi Yuan noticed his small movement. She smiled faintly and said, Don't be nervous. If I want to make a move, you and Su Chan won't have a chance to fight back. I'm not hostile, I just want to chat with you. If it had been anyone else who said this, Li Yundong would definitely have felt disgusted and wanted to compete with them. However, when Zi Yuan said this, Li Yundong felt that it was natural and right. What the hell? Li Yundong muttered in his heart, but he said, It's one thing whether you can beat me or not, but if you want to touch Su Chan, you'll have to step over my dead body. Su Chan poked her head out from behind Li Yundong and stared at Zi Yuan nervously. I stole the Renyuan Jindan, she said. Don't make trouble for Li Yundong. Li Yundong turned his head and glared at her. Shut up. Su Chan was startled by his words and immediately shrank her head back. But soon, she stiffened her neck and said stubbornly, That's right. I'll take responsibility for my own actions. Didn't you chase me for so long for the Renyuan Jindan? Zi Yuan smiled and said, Su Chan, if I wanted to catch you, how could I let you run so far? Besides, if it weren't for your master with your ability, would you have been able to snatch the Renyuan Jindan? As she said this, Zi Yuan's eyes fell on Li Yundong again, and her eyes were full of curiosity and doubt. I came here to figure out one thing. To see the net. 7K. Oath M. Li Yundong stared at Zi Yuan closely, for fear that she would do something bad to Su Chan. He asked, What is it? Zi Yuan stared at Li Yundong, as if she was in a trance. She didn't speak, and for a moment, Li Yundong didn't know what to say. Everyone in the huge hall seemed to have been hit by a spell, and there was a pin-drop silence. After a while, Zi Yuan laughed and said, Sorry, I was distracted. As for what it is, you don't need to know. Even if you knew, you wouldn't understand. But what I want to tell you is that I'm not here to get the Renyuan Jindan back. What's more, the Renyuan Jindan has already been taken by you, so it's impossible for me to get it back. Li Yundong said. Then what do you want? Zi Yuan looked around and said, Let's go somewhere else. This is really not a good place to talk. As she said this, she walked out of the hall. Li Yundong pondered for a moment and followed her. Behind him, Su Chan grabbed his clothes tightly and shook her head vigorously. She looked frightened. Yundong, don't go. She must want to lure you to a place with fewer people so that she can attack you. Li Yundong laughed and stroked Su Chan's cheek lovingly. Little fool, there are some things that can't be avoided. Wait here, I'll go and have a look. There are many people here, so I don't think she will do anything to you. To see the net. 7K. Oath M. Su Chan refused to let go. She wrapped her arms tightly around Li Yundong's and shook her head like a rattle. No, I want to go with you. You can't leave me behind. Have you forgotten that we pinky promise? As she said this, Su Chan stretched out her little finger and looked at Li Yundong eagerly. Pinky promise for 100 years. Don't change, you said it. Li Yundong's heart warmed. He stretched out his hand and hooked his finger with the little girl's, saying, You silly girl, if something goes wrong later, don't worry about me. Run away first. Do you hear me? Su Chan nodded hard, but in her heart she said, You want me to run first, but if I run away, you won't be by my side. Where can I go? I might as well accompany you to die together. Li Yundong saw the heroic expression on the little girl's face, and he more or less guessed what Su Chan was thinking. He didn't say anything, just smiled, and then followed Zi Yuan out. Although Zi Yuan didn't see Li Yundong walking in front, she was a cultivator with great shintong. With the heavenly eye in the back of her head, she could clearly see what was happening behind her. When she saw Li Yundong and Su Chan's entangled appearance, she sighed in her heart, What a love fool. After leaving the gate of the Shengyuan Hotel, Li Yundong followed Zi Yuan for a while and came to the street behind the Shengyuan Hotel. Seeing that there were not many people around, he stopped and said, What do you want from me? Just say it. Zi Yuan also stopped and said softly, Last time, my shimmy came to see you, but you took away the magical item. Can you return it to me now? Your shimmy? Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, but he quickly reacted and said angrily, That crazy woman last time is your shimmy? You want me to return her magical item? No way. I haven't even settled the score with her for hurting Su Chan yet. Zi Yuan said with a smile, You also injured her soul and took away her magical item. Isn't that even? You should know that if a cultivator's magical item is taken away, it will be a great shame. It's better to get rid of the enmity than to keep it alive. What do you think? Li Yundong sneered and said, It's not that I deliberately went to take her magical item. It was she who came to us to make trouble. Her magical item was taken away and her soul was injured. That was what she asked for. It has nothing to do with me. Zi Yuan said, But humans and demons can't coexist. You have a fox spirit as your companion. As a cultivator, you have the obligation and responsibility to enforce justice on behalf of heaven. Hong Ling's action is understandable. When Li Yundong heard this, he immediately became furious. Bullshasterisk T. What do you mean by humans and demons can't coexist? Su Chan has never hurt anyone. I like her, and she likes me. How is it any of your business that we want to be together? He thought. Are you guys so bored that your balls hurt? They don't have balls. Su Chan whispered from behind Li Yundong. Li Yundong almost burst out laughing when he heard this. He turned his head and glared at Su Chan, making her stick out her bright red tongue. Only then did he turn his face away. Zi Yuan didn't seem to see their little movements. She still asked calmly, Then what do you want to do for you to return my shimmy's magical item to me? Li Yundong thought for a moment and said, Ask her to apologize to me and Su Chan and never harass us again. Then I'll return it to you. Zi Yuan thought for a moment and shook her head slightly. With my shimmy's temper, she won't apologize. How about this? I apologize on her behalf. Okay? Li Yundong was about to open his mouth to speak, but Su Chan, who was behind him, tugged at his clothes and whispered, Yundong, give that magical item back to her. Zi Yuan has a very high reputation in the cultivation world. She never apologizes to anyone. It's not easy for her to say such a thing today. Moreover, Zhengyi school is very powerful. It's better not to offend them. Li Yundong retorted. Does being powerful mean you can oppress others? If you're reasonable, you can go anywhere in the world. If you're unreasonable, you can't do anything. This matter was originally their fault. They ignored so many unfair things in the world and insisted on meddling in our business. They even said that they were enforcing justice on behalf of heaven. Li Yundong sneered and said to Zi Yuan, Everyone should be responsible for what they have done. Whoever did something wrong should apologize. What's the point of you apologizing on her behalf? As soon as he finished speaking, Ruan Hongling suddenly appeared beside Zi Yuan out of thin air and shouted angrily, Sister Zi Yuan, why are you wasting time with such a person? You even want to apologize. Aren't you afraid of losing the face of our Xueqi school's Linggong sect? Besides, I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I apologize? As soon as Li Yundong saw the girl who had injured Su Chan and almost caused him to be separated from her, he suddenly became angry and became bold. He was full of anger and glared at Ruan Hongling fiercely. You're still in the right. Well, if you have any means, just come at me. I want to see what your so-called Xueqi school can do. As he spoke, he rolled up his sleeves and looked like he was ready to fight. Su Chan whispered behind him. Yundong, use the Divine Thunder Talisman. Zi Yuan saw that as soon as Ruan Hongling and Li Yundong met, sparks immediately flew in all directions. It was really like when enemies met, their eyes were exceptionally red. She couldn't help but feel a headache. She looked at Ruan Hongling reproachfully and asked, Why are you following me? Ruan Hongling said angrily, If I don't follow you, you will lose the face of Xueqi school and our Linggong sect. Zi Yuan couldn't help but say angrily, How dare you talk to me like that? Ruan Hongling had lived under Zi Yuan's wing for many years and had accumulated a deep prestige. Her heart suddenly trembled and she didn't dare to say another word. She just turned her face away and snorted. Isn't that so? Zi Yuan couldn't help but say coldly, If you still regard me as your Xueqi, apologize immediately. Don't you want your magical item? Ruan Hongling turned her head abruptly, as if she couldn't believe her ears. She cried out in shock and surprise. Sister Zi Yuan, are you crazy or possessed? How dare you ask me to apologize to him? What did I do wrong? Ruan Hongling stared at Li Yundong with incomparable hatred and said through gritted teeth, I'll pretend that I never had the magical item. Keep it for yourself. I'd rather die than apologize to you. Li Yundong sneered and was about to speak when suddenly an Audi A6 drove over from the side of the road. The car stopped by the side of the road and the window rolled down. A beautiful woman peeked out from inside. It was Zhou Qin. Zhou Qin looked at Li Yundong, then at Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Ruan Hongling. She asked in confusion, Li Yundong, what are you doing here, /om/? Chapter 155. Go to see Net. Zhou Qin's appearance greatly eased the smoky scene. Li Yundong glanced at Ruan Hongling and snorted. Nothing, but what are you doing here? I seem to have seen Ding Nan before. An unnatural look flashed across Zhou Qin's face. Well, I made an appointment to meet her here to talk about something. Go to see Net. Zhou Qin quickly changed the subject. Who are these two? Your friends? Li Yundong sneered. How could I have such friends? Aren't you afraid of shortening your life? Ruan Hongling was furious. Just as she was about to speak, she saw Zi Yuan glaring at her majestically. Ruan Hongling stomped her feet angrily and shouted at Zi Yuan, Do you care so much about that psalm? Sister Zi Yuan, I am your shimmy. Will you help him or not? Is the successor of Jin Dan so important to you? As soon as these words came out, Zi Yuan's Taoist heart was in chaos. She glared at Ruan Hongling angrily. Li Yundong and Su Chan looked at each other, not knowing what Ruan Hongling meant. Zhou Qin was even more confused and asked in confusion, What are you talking about? Li Yundong whispered to Zhou Qin, this is none of your business. Leave first. Don't get involved. Zhou Qin became more and more confused, but she was a very curious girl. As soon as she heard Li Yundong's words, she got out of the car and looked at Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan warily. What are they going to do? Is there any trouble? Do you need help? Before Li Yundong could speak, Ruan Hongling shouted at Zhou Qin like a firecracker, Get out of here. This is none of your business. Li Yundong was furious. He turned to Ruan Hongling and said, Be polite with your words. Ruan Hongling rolled up her sleeves and was about to rush over aggressively. I'm not going to be polite with you. Li Yundong also clenched his fists, his fingers cracking. Well, don't think that I won't beat you just because you are a girl. Today, I will discipline you on behalf of your parents. Just as the two of them were about to make a move, they suddenly heard the sound of a heavy object hitting the ground. Everyone was stunned. They turned around and saw a girl lying on the ground in a pool of blood 3 or 4 meters away. The girl was wearing the waiter's uniform of Shangyuan Hotel. Her clothes were untidy, and her face was facing down. Although Li Yundong couldn't see her face clearly, He could clearly see the red headband on the girl's head because the waiter's hat had fallen off. This is Deng Yu? Li Yundong's pupils instantly dilated. He felt as if someone had smashed his chest with a hammer, and his whole body shook. Ruan Hongling also stopped fighting with Li Yundong for a moment. She quickly walked over to the girl with Zi Yuan, took a look, and shook her head. There's no hope. Li Yundong's heart trembled as he walked closer to take a look. Sure enough, he saw Deng Yu lying in a pool of blood. His eyes were wide open, and blood kept bubbling out of his mouth. WatchNet. 7K. Oath M. Rainbow Carrot * literature _learning % super #speed. Update. What's going on? Li Yundong only felt that his hair was about to stand on end, and an inexplicable feeling filled his heart, moving and manic. Deng Yu's eyes moved. Before she died, she saw Li Yundong and forced a smile, her lips wriggling. At this moment, Li Yundong seemed to see the cunning smile of the girl in the cafeteria at noon. If I wanted to say something, I wouldn't say it here. There are so many beautiful women here, and the pressure is too great. However, now Deng Yu couldn't say it even if she wanted to. Li Yundong's lips trembled. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly heard a heart-wrenching cry coming from above his head. Everyone immediately looked up. On the balcony of Shengyuan Hotel, a girl was lying on the balcony railing, crying loudly with her hair disheveled. Li Yundong's eyesight was very strong, and he recognized at a glance that the girl was wearing a blue headband. It was Deng Yu's sister, Deng Jiao. At this time, a man came out of the room, pulled her up with one hand, and looked down. With this, Li Yundong immediately understood something. He was so angry that he seemed to be about to explode. He roared, "Young Master He!" Although they were separated by 15 floors and 20 to 30 meters, young Master He could still clearly feel Li Yundong's boiling murderous intent and his sharp gaze. Li Yundong glared at him from below. It was as if his gaze was real, and it made young Master He's heart beat wildly. He didn't dare to look at her anymore. He dragged Deng Jiao into the room and roared like a frightened beast. "Is your sister crazy? Why is she courting death?" Deng Jiao's face was covered in tears. The eyes of this usually shy girl were fierce and resentful like a demon from hell. She stared at young Master He without saying a word. She bit her lips hard with her teeth, and blood flowed down the corner of her mouth. She suddenly roared and pounced on young Master He, biting his forearm tightly. Go to the internet. 7K. Oath M. Young Master He let out a miserable howl and struggled crazily, pushing Deng Jiao with all his might. Deng Jiao bit off a piece of flesh from young Master He's forearm. Her body was also pushed by young Master He, and she took 3 steps back and hit the balcony. She lost her balance. Young Master He was scared out of his wits. He subconsciously stretched out his hand, and Deng Jiao instantly disappeared from the edge of the balcony. After Li Yundong saw young Master He immediately ran into the hotel angrily. Su Chan immediately followed him. Zhou Qin was shocked by this sudden scene. She subconsciously chased after Li Yundong and shouted, "Li Yundong, calm down." Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan looked at each other. Zi Yuan said in a deep voice, "Let's go and take a look." Just as the two of them turned around and left, they suddenly heard the dull sound of someone falling from the building behind them. This time, the air seemed to have frozen. Li Yundong immediately froze in place like a statue, motionless. However, his quiet back made Zhou Qin and Su Chan feel even more terrified. This boy was like a volcano that was about to erupt and a tsunami that was about to come. The air was filled with an extremely terrifying anger. Li Yundong's whole body trembled slightly because of his anger. He turned his face, and his eyes were filled with blood vessels that were about to burst out of anger. He saw Deng Jiao, who had fallen next to Deng Yu, and suddenly, it was as if a flame had brushed past his chest. He instantly exploded, pointed at young Master He's residence on the 15th floor, and shouted, "Young Master He, you beast! You will die a horrible death." Young Master He trembled all over as he listened to the murderous and terrifying voice in the room. He was afraid, he was terrified. He didn't know why he had caused such a terrible thing by playing with 2 girls. Why was this happening? Young Master He paced back and forth in the room like a mad beast. His back was drenched in cold sweat. "No, I have to get out of here quickly. This lunatic will kill me. I will die. A person like me shouldn't bother with such a commoner. Young master, he shuddered when he thought of the terrifying power that Li Yundong had displayed at the school gate last time. As soon as he made up his mind, young master he took his car key and rushed out of the door. But as soon as he left the door, he immediately turned around and went back to his room. He took out a Type 54 pistol from under his pillow and hid it on his body. At the bottom of the Shengyuan Hotel, Li Yundong was about to go upstairs to catch young master he with a murderous look, but he was stopped by Xueqi. Xueqi advised him loudly, "Li Yundong, this matter should be left to the police. Don't be impulsive. You will get yourself into trouble." Li Yundong was furious. "Police? What else can the police do other than protect powerful people like you?" Xueqi felt a sharp pain in her heart. She subconsciously wanted to turn around and leave, but she gritted her teeth and continued to persuade him earnestly. "What can you do even if you find him? Don't worry, leave it to me. I will make him pay for what he deserves. You have to think about Xueqi. If you go in, what will happen to her in the future?" But just as he was about to say something, a black BMW suddenly burst out of the parking lot next to the Shengyuan Hotel with a loud bang. The car sped from the crosswalk to the road like a runaway wild horse. A pregnant woman, who didn't dodge in time, was instantly hit and sent flying. Li Yundong's anger subsided as soon as he heard Xueqi's name. But just as he was about to say something, a black BMW suddenly burst out of the parking lot next to the Shengyuan Hotel. Xueqi was stunned. The first thing she saw was the car and its license plate. She subconsciously said, "Young master he?" Li Yundong's anger, which had just subsided, suddenly flared up again. He was so angry that his eyes were about to split open. With a loud roar, his body rushed out like a cannonball and crazily chased after young master he's car. Xueqi was stunned and immediately chased after him. At this time, there was also a flash of anger in Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling's eyes. Ruan Hongling shouted angrily, "Damn it, who is this? So hateful. He deserves to be killed." Zi Yuan glanced at her, suppressed her anger, and said, "Cultivators don't care about worldly affairs." Ruan Hongling said angrily, "Then what should we do now?" Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "Go and collect the souls of these two sisters first. After I return to the mountain, I will use the 5 days' rain and dew lotus to rebuild their bodies." Young master he drove the BMW and stepped on the accelerator, pressing the horn crazily. He didn't even realize that he had hit someone. In his mind, he only wanted to escape as far away from Li Yundong as possible. When young master he drove into the main road, he subconsciously looked up at the rearview mirror and immediately saw a figure quickly chasing after him. It didn't matter when he saw it, but young master he was scared out of his wits. He suddenly turned his head back and saw Li Yundong chasing after him with a ferocious expression and a murderous aura. He was like a demon who wanted to take his life. Young master he's entire body was trembling. He smacked the horn crazily and urged the car in front of him to move quickly. However, there was a red light in front of him and a long line of cars were parked there. How could he move? Young master he gritted his teeth, stepped on the accelerator, and fiercely turned the steering wheel. The car turned into the wrong lane and sped all the way. Li Yundong felt as if there was a ball of fire burning in his chest. It was as if there was a high-speed motor in his body that was crazily transporting qi and blood to his internal organs and 2 thighs. He was like a crazy beast, chasing after the black BMW on the road. Li Yundong's legs were like scissors that were constantly crossing at high speed. Every time he took a step, the ground seemed to tremble. He saw that the black BMW was getting closer and closer, and the anger in his heart grew stronger and stronger. Suddenly, the black BMW made a sharp turn and sped in the opposite direction of the road. Li Yundong jumped to the back of the car that was turning around and reached out to grab it. This claw was really like a steel claw. His 5 fingers forcefully dug into the iron cover of the back cover of the car. With a tearing sound, he forcefully dug out 5 deep fingerprints on the iron cover. When young master he heard the sound coming from behind the car, his heart was beating wildly in fear. He stepped on the accelerator crazily, and a hysterical roar came from the BMW. There was even a puff of smoke coming from the front cover of the car. Li Yundong only felt a huge force pulling him forward. "You want to run?" Li Yundong roared and sank his qi into his dantian. He lowered his legs and exerted force from his waist. His 5 fingers, which were like steel claws, forcefully tore off the back seat cover of the car like a piece of paper. At this moment, the BMW was like a wild horse that had broken free of its reins and instantly ran away. Li Yundong threw the iron plate on the back of the car to the ground. He didn't care about shocking the world and chased after it with a roar. /OM/ Chapter 156. Go to Watch Network. Young Master he drove on the wrong side of the road. For a moment, he ran amok, and the people on the road were thrown into a mess. Li Yundong chased after him relentlessly, and the anger in his heart burned stronger and stronger. Go to C. 7K. OM. Super_speed. More. New. There was only one thought in his mind. Chase after him, chase after him. Su Chan, who had been following closely behind, looked at Li Yundong's back worriedly. She wanted to persuade him, but she had never seen Li Yundong so angry before. Just as the words she wanted to say were about to come out of her mouth, she couldn't help but swallow them. At this time, there were the most people and cars on the road. Young Master he couldn't drive fast on the road, so he had no choice but to turn to a route with fewer cars. Unknowingly, he drove near Tiannan University. When he drove past Tiannan University and entered a street, an old woman happened to walk out of the alley, pushing a vegetable cart in her hand. Young Master he couldn't brake in time, and with a loud bang, the person in the cart were sent flying. The car also crashed into the side of the road and stopped. Young Master he was so scared that his entire body trembled. Young Master he was so scared that his entire body trembled. He propped himself up and wanted to see if the old woman was okay. He saw that the old woman had fallen to the ground and was struggling to stand up. He immediately heaved a sigh of relief and twisted the car key to continue escaping. Suddenly, a young man pounced over from the car door. It was Lu. He angrily smashed his car door. "You beast, how do you drive? You hit my mother." As he spoke, he turned his head to look at his mother and shouted, "Mom, are you okay?" Young Master he turned his head and looked back. He saw Li Yundong's small figure chasing after him like a ghost, and it was getting closer and closer. His body trembled, and he quickly took out all the money he had on him and threw it out. He shouted in horror, "Get out of the way! Get out of the way!" Lu reached in through the window and grabbed Young Master he's steering wheel tightly. He shouted, "So what if you have money? Get out of the car. Don't even think about leaving." Young Master he didn't dare to get out of the car. He watched as Li Yundong, the Demon King, got closer and closer. He became more and more terrified and confused. All of a sudden, Young Master he's hand swept across a cold hard object that was stuffed into his waist. His heart was suddenly filled with rage. He pulled out the gun at his waist, pointed it at Lu and roared, "Get out of my way!" Lu was a stubborn man. He roared, "How dare you! Shoot me if you have the guts. Get out of the car. If you don't send my mom to the hospital, don't even think about leaving." Young Master he kept turning around to look behind him. His back was drenched in sweat. His face was distorted as he roared hysterically, "Get out of my way, I'm really going to shoot." Lu also turned his head and followed Young Master he's gaze. When he saw it, he immediately shouted in surprise and joy, "Benefactor." When Young Master he heard these two words, his heart sank. These two people were in cahoots. Without any hesitation, he fired 3 consecutive shots at Lu. Lu's body trembled. He turned his head around as if he couldn't believe that the young man before him had the guts to pull the trigger. His body swayed and he looked down at the 3 bloody holes in his chest. His body softly fell to the ground. Watch net. 7K. OM. Young Master he forcefully pulled Lu's arm away from his car window and started the car with all his might. As soon as he stepped on the accelerator, he saw an old woman pouncing at the front of his car like a madwoman. She bared her fangs and brandished her claws. Her expression was crazy. "Give me back my son, you beast!" Young Master he was so shocked by the old woman's crazy look that his entire body trembled. He unconsciously exerted force under his feet and the car rushed out with a roar. In an instant, the old woman disappeared in front of the car. Then, the car shook and ran over the old woman. "You asked for it, you asked for it." Young Master he cursed as if he had gone mad. Li Yundong witnessed all of this from behind. He was so angry that he was about to explode. He wished he could put a pair of wings on himself. But when he ran to the scene of the murder, Young Master He's car was already more than 10 meters away. Lu had been shot 3 times and could not die immediately. He struggled on the ground and crawled towards his mother. As he crawled, he rubbed the ground with blood. With great difficulty, he crawled in front of his mother and checked her breath with his hand. Immediately, he let out a heart-wrenching cry, "Mom!" B****, you deserve to be killed. Li Yundong was beyond angry. The aura all over his body was like a berserk beast as he roared. His 2 legs exerted force, and his body instantly soared into the air, forcibly jumping 5 or 6 meters away. Then, after landing like a meteorite, his 2 thighs suddenly kicked fiercely, and his body flew again with a rub. The furious Li Yundong's physical strength had reached an incredible level at this moment. He jumped forward at high speed like the Hulk in the movie. His legs were like 2 powerful steel springs, bouncing Li Yundong into the air and quickly chasing after young Master He. Li Yundong's figure was really terrifying during this crazy chase. Fortunately, this road was relatively remote and near the suburbs of the city. After chasing for a while, Li Yundong chased after young Master He out of the city. Go to watch net. 7K. Oath M. Seeing that Li Yundong was getting closer and closer, young Master He was so shocked that he was flustered. He stepped on the accelerator, but even so, Li Yundong was still getting closer and closer. In a panic, He Xiao leaned over and tried to shoot Li Yundong with his gun. But Zhao Yujin couldn't even hit Li Yundong at close range. He Xiao was driving and was more than 10 meters away, so how could he hit Li Yundong? Li Yundong didn't even dodge. His eyes were burning with anger as he stared straight at young Master He's car. His footsteps were getting faster and faster, as if he had installed 2 wind and fire wheels. Young Master He fired a few shots in a row but missed. When he pulled the trigger again, there was the sound of an empty chamber. He threw the gun away, and when he turned around again, he saw that he was already driving on the wrong side of the road. A car on the opposite side of the road was charging at him. Young Master He was so shocked that he jerked the steering wheel. The BMW squeaked and drew a crooked S-shaped arc on the road. This time, Li Yundong immediately caught up. Stop right there. When Li Yundong was chasing after him, he didn't dare to speak or even stop. It was because he was afraid that the qi in his body would dissipate the moment he opened his mouth, or that he would let young Master He escape if he stopped and started running again. But seeing that the BMW was right in front of him, Li Yundong couldn't hold it in anymore. He roared, bent over, grabbed the chassis of the BMW with both hands, and lifted it hard. The BMW immediately spun a few times in the air and flew out. It landed on the side of the road with a loud bang and kept rolling. After the BMW rolled for a while, it finally stopped. Young Master He, who was inside, didn't fall to his death. He only scratched a piece of skin on his forehead. He struggled out of the car and shouted desperately and crazily, "You dare to kill me? You dare to kill me?" Li Yundong clenched his fists tightly, and a terrifying murderous aura appeared in his eyes. "I don't dare to kill you." As he said this, he walked over and picked up young Master He with one hand. His eyes were so wide open that the corners of his eyes were about to crack. His voice was trembling with anger. "You heartless beast, how could you do it?" Young Master He roared loudly, "I didn't want to. They forced me. You forced me to do it." Li Yundong was furious. He raised his fist high. If he punched down, young Master He's head would be smashed like a tomato, and blood would splatter everywhere. But just as Li Yundong was about to punch him, Xueqi, who was following closely behind in the car, shouted in horror, "No, Li Yundong. If you kill him, you will also pay with your life." When Li Yundong heard the voice behind him, he suddenly turned his head and said with a terrifying look in his eyes, "Are you going to let him go just like that?" Xueqi didn't care about locking the car. She rushed to him and begged loudly, "Don't be impulsive. The law will punish him." With so many people seeing him cause the accident, he definitely won't be able to escape. While she was speaking, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Wan Hongling also arrived. There were also some cars parked by the side of the road, and a few people were pointing at them. Seeing that there were more and more people around, Li Yundong hesitated for a moment. He suddenly laughed wildly and said, "Ha ha ha, come and kill me. Do you dare to kill me? With so many people watching you, if you kill me, where can you go in the future?" Li Yundong was so angry that his whole body was trembling. Xueqi also scolded him loudly. Young Master He, you are so crazy. Do you really think that there is no law in this world that can punish you? Young Master He jumped up and roared loudly, Law? What kind of law is the law? Let me tell you, I am the law in Tiannan City. I am the law. Who saw me cause the accident? Come out who? Ruan Hongling had seen everything along the way. Although she had a grudge with Li Yundong, she couldn't help but say angrily, You have done so many evil things. Aren't you afraid of being struck by lightning? Struck by lightning? Young Master He was stunned for a moment when he heard this, but then he covered his stomach and laughed out loud, as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. Struck by lightning. Hee ha 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 ha. I'm dying of laughter. Young Master He laughed wildly. He pointed to the sky and roared, God, I have done many evil things. Come and strike me to death. Young Master He's arrogant voice spread far away, but the world was as calm as usual. There was no movement at all, only young Master He's wild laughter continued to ring out. Heaven was heartless and treated all living things as dogs. There were so many evil people in the world, but no one had ever seen God strike one to death. Everyone understood this, but everyone hoped that a bolt of lightning would fall from the sky and strike this beast to death. Ruan Hongling was so angry that she gritted her teeth. Just as she was about to step forward, she was stopped by Zi Yuan and said coldly, Stop. Have you forgotten the commandment that cultivators can't attack mortals? Ruan Hongling was so angry that her lungs were about to explode. She shouted angrily, Don't be complacent. Sooner or later, God will take you away. Young Master He laughed even more wildly and said, God will take me away? Ha 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 God, I beg of you, please come and take me. Young Master He shouted like a hysterical madman for a while, but the sky was still calm as usual. Young Master He laughed wildly and said, Did you see that? God won't care about you people. God won't take me away. Li Yundong couldn't help it anymore. He shouted, If God doesn't take you away, I will. /om/. Chapter 157. Go to watch net. After Li Yundong roared, he suddenly raised his hand, holding a dim yellow paper talisman in his hand. At this time, the qi and blood in his body were surging. The paper talisman was also attracted by Li Yundong's huge Jindan's qi and began to emit a faint white light. Go to watch net. Hongom 5 Thunder Righteous Talisman. Zi Yuan was so shocked that she shouted. At this moment, she thought of the saying, Once the Jindan appears, the mortal world is settled, and the thunder first rings, revealing the truth. Is this the truth of the psalm? Zi Yuan's mind was buzzing. She calmed down a little and couldn't help shouting, Li Yundong, cultivators can't attack mortals. Li Yundong turned his head angrily and roared, What bull***t rule? Zi Yuan shouted, For thousands of years, cultivators can't use magic on mortals. This is the iron law of the cultivation world. Those who violate it will suffer divine punishment. Li Yundong couldn't help laughing angrily. Ha ha ha, those who really do evil don't have to suffer divine punishment, but those who enforce justice on behalf of heaven have to suffer divine punishment? What kind of **king rule is this? Although Ruan Hongling had a grudge against Li Yundong, she couldn't help but advise him loudly, Heaven and earth have their own karma. If cultivators use magic to hurt mortals, they will attract divine punishment. Their souls will be shattered and they will not be able to reincarnate. Zi Yuan said in a deep voice, This iron law can't be broken by you. Stop. Li Yundong said angrily, I'm not a cultivator. I don't care about this bull***t rule. Zi Yuan also said angrily, as the successor of Jindan, you are only one step away from the Zhuji phase. How can you not be a cultivator? As long as the 5 Thunder Righteous Talisman in your hand is released, it will immediately violate the law of heaven and bring great shock and destruction to the cultivation world. As a cultivator, I absolutely can't tolerate such a thing happening. Li Yundong couldn't help but fly into a rage. He pointed at Zi Yuan and scolded, I saw that you looked like a fairy, but I didn't expect you to be so cruel and cold-blooded. Tell me, what are you cultivating for? To become an immortal tortoise? As he said this, he pointed at Ruan Hongling and cursed, And you don't deal with such scumbags in the world. You only know how to make trouble for me and Su Chan. Is this what you call a decent sect? Is this what you call a righteous person? Li Yundong's angry roar echoed in everyone's ears like rolling thunder, shaking the hearts of everyone here. Watch net. Net. Super_speed. More. New cultivation, 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 cultivation. What are you cultivating for? After witnessing such a thing with your own eyes, how can you turn around and walk away? What's the difference between you and beasts? Li Yundong spat on the ground. I really look down on you sanctimonious guys. He kept on talking about rules and heavenly laws, but he was actually thinking of himself, afraid that he would be implicated. After cultivating for a lifetime, if you can't help the weak and enforce justice on behalf of heaven, then what's the difference between you and a tortoise? Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan were dumbfounded by Li Yundong's scolding, especially Zi Yuan. She had been extremely talented in cultivation since she was a child. Although she was young, she had a great reputation in the cultivation world. When she traveled in the world, the leaders of other sects had to politely call her Zhenren Zi Yuan when they saw her. When had she ever been pointed at and scolded like this? However, Zi Yuan wanted to refute, but her heart suddenly trembled. Li Yundong's words had evoked a question in her heart that had been puzzling for a long time. What was the purpose of cultivation? Just for the sake of immortality? The more Li Yundong scolded, the angrier he became. The more he scolded, the more he couldn't control his emotions. He was furious and said, "How dare you say that you want to stop me? Touch your chests and see if they are warm. You are all as beautiful as flowers, but you are so cold-blooded. If God doesn't accept a beast like him, I will. You don't dare to enforce justice on behalf of heaven. Today I, Li Yundong, will enforce justice on behalf of heaven." As he said this, Li Yundong's aura suddenly burst forth. The majestic yuanqi that he had accumulated for a long time suddenly rushed straight to the top of Li Yundong's head like the dam was opened. This aura was as majestic as the Milky Way pouring down, like a torrent surging, mighty and unstoppable, and instantly ran through all the meridians in Li Yundong's body. All the essence, qi, and blood in Li Yundong's body instantly gathered on the top of his head. The qi of the 5 internal organs in his body was also attracted by the Jindan's yuanqi and surged toward the top of his head. This was the qi-rushing canopy. 3 flowers at the acupoint. 5 qis collecting in mind. After these majestic and powerful auras instantly gathered on the top of Li Yundong's head, they hit the Bai Hui acupoint on the top of his head. A white qi visible to the naked eye rose, condensed, and rushed straight into the sky. The divine thunder talisman in Li Yundong's hand felt his powerful Jindan's primordial qi and suddenly burned with a bang. Countless rune patterns flew out of the flames, surrounding the top of Li Yundong's head and soaring into the sky in an instant. In an instant, the color of heaven and earth suddenly changed. With a buzz, the sky darkened, and countless dark clouds quickly rushed over from the horizon. In the blink of an eye, the dark clouds were rolling, and it was as if the sky had collapsed. It was almost impossible to see one's fingers in front of them. Boom! There was a dull sound of thunder rolling in the thick dark clouds. This kind of sound represented the strongest power in the world, the supreme judgment and majesty. Young master, he looked at the rolling clouds in the sky with his mouth agape. He was in a daze for a while, as if he didn't dare to imagine that there would really be a bolt of lightning in the sky. Suddenly, he was afraid and rushed toward Li Yundong like crazy. "Don't kill me!" Li Yundong kicked him away and said angrily, "It's too late. A beast like you only knows how to repent now. Can you bring the dead back to life?" After that, Li Yundong pointed to the sky and shouted. His voice shook everything in the world as if it was trembling. "Heavenly thunder! Boom! Kacha!" A bolt of lightning suddenly flashed through the dark sky, instantly illuminating the dark world. In the eyes of everyone, Li Yundong's hair stood on end at this time. His expression was angry and mighty. His whole body was emitting a layer of dazzling golden light, as if a golden armored warrior had descended from heaven to enforce justice on behalf of heaven. Li Yundong pointed at young Master He, who was lying limply on the ground. His words were like spring thunder, and he shouted wildly, "Kill evil!" Boom! A bolt of lightning fell from the sky in an instant, and this bolt of lightning instantly swallowed young Master He. In an instant, the world seemed to have become extremely bright, so dazzling that people couldn't open their eyes. They subconsciously closed their eyes. They only felt a sudden heat around them, as if the air was burning. After a long time, the surrounding people opened their eyes and saw that the sky had regained its brightness. There were bursts of green smoke around the big pit. The place where young Master He was located had been struck by lightning and a deep pit had been created. His body and soul had been destroyed, and there were no bones left. It was as if this person had never appeared. There was no ashes left. At this moment, the surroundings were extremely quiet. Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling looked at Li Yundong with an inexplicable gaze. Go to see the net. Zi Yuan's heart was extremely complicated. She looked at Li Yundong in a daze and couldn't say anything. Although Ruan Hongling had always hated Li Yundong because of her grudge with him, she couldn't help but admire him at this time. How many cultivators were there in the world? But no cultivator had ever dared to do such a thing. But only this person in front of her dared to sacrifice himself to get rid of evil and enforce justice on behalf of heaven. At this time, Ruan Hongling had even forgotten the grudge between her and Li Yundong. She had forgotten that Li Yundong had scolded her before. Her heart was filled with admiration and joy. She couldn't wait to cheer loudly and shout, "Good man, good courage!" After Li Yundong used the divine thunder talisman, he felt as if all the strength in his body had been used up in an instant. He stood there in a daze for a long time, and the anger and blood in his chest gradually calmed down. After a long time, he turned around and found that the little girl was looking at him with tears streaming down her face. Li Yundong forced a smile and said, "I always said that you were a troublemaker. Now, I've caused a big disaster." As a cultivator, Xueqi knew very well what terrible consequences there would be if she violated the law of heaven. The little girl was shocked and scared. She couldn't help but throw herself into Li Yundong's arms and cry loudly. No, you didn't cause trouble. You are enforcing justice on behalf of heaven. God will be merciful and open his eyes." Li Yundong couldn't help but sneer and say, "God is merciful? God is merciful? If he were merciful, he would have put this crazy beast away just now." Xueqi quickly covered Li Yundong's mouth with her hand and said with a frightened expression, "You can't say it, you can't say it." Li Yundong forced a smile and said, "Silly girl, husband and wife are birds in the same forest. When disaster comes, they fly separately. Do you remember what I told you before? If there's something wrong, don't worry about me. Hurry up and go by yourself. It's better for one to die than two." As soon as Li Yundong finished speaking, Xueqi couldn't help but burst into tears and hugged Li Yundong tightly. I won't go. I can't do it without you." Li Yundong smiled and stroked the little girl's soft black hair. He said lovingly, "Stop it, girl. You used to live a good and happy life without me, didn't you?" Xueqi just kept shaking her head, tears rolling down her face. "No, I can't do it without you." Li Yundong held Xueqi with one hand and sighed softly. "Why didn't you persuade me just now? Maybe if you had persuaded me, I would have stopped." Xueqi raised her head, her eyes full of tears, and said in a choked voice, "I wanted to persuade you, but I thought that if I persuaded you to stop, you would be depressed and regretful when you thought about it in the future. You might even blame me. I would feel sad. You said that you didn't want to see me behave in the future, and I don't want to see you frowning and regretting every day. So I thought that when the divine tribulation came, I would risk my life to die with you. I've been happy with you for so many days, so it's not a big deal to die." Li Yundong's eyes were full of tears. He raised his head and sighed. "You know me. Others say that you are a witch, but in my opinion, you are the most lovely and considerate woman in the world. How can I, Li Yundong, have a woman like you as a companion?" As they spoke, the two of them looked at each other and smiled at the same time. The lingering affection in their eyes was so strong that it could not be dissolved. It was as if the divine tribulation would fall on their heads in the next second. It was no big deal. /om/ Chapter 158. Go to watch net. Looking at Li Yundong and Xueqi's affectionate appearance, for a moment, Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan sighed inwardly. Go to watch net. Regardless of whether they have violated the taboo between them, at least the feelings between them are deep. Zi Yuan sighed slightly in her heart. Xueqi was in a daze. She suddenly found that the boy in front of her and the girl in front of her were so strange. She thought that she had gotten closer to Li Yundong and understood this boy more and more, but in the end, she found that she knew nothing about this boy. In the past, Guan Yunchang, the sage of martial arts, killed the bully in a rage when he saw the bully bullying the villagers. In the end, he went into exile and even changed his name. I didn't expect that this boy, who looks easygoing and likes to joke, is such a character. But at that time, it was the three kingdoms in chaos, and human life was as cheap as grass. But now it is a peaceful time, and there is actually such a character like Emperor Guan. Zhou Qin was shocked by Li Yundong's actions, and her heart was filled with an indescribable feeling. She stared at Li Yundong and Su Chan, watching the two of them hugging each other tightly, as if they would not be separated even if the sea ran dry and the rocks crumbled. Zhou Qin's heart was squeezed fiercely. She suddenly realized that it was impossible for her to get between these two people in her life, because they loved each other so much that they were even willing to give up their lives for each other. What in the world could separate such a pair of lovers who loved each other so much? At this moment, Zhou Qin's heart was as cold as ash. Li Yundong and Su Chan hugged each other tightly. He only had eyes for her, and she only had eyes for him. What the people around them were watching and talking had nothing to do with them. Whether it was divine punishment or anything else, they had all been thrown to the back of their minds. At this moment, they knew that the other party loved them. Although they didn't say it out loud, their infatuated eyes had already explained everything. Zi Yuan seemed to be unable to bear to see the pair of lovers being separated like this. She couldn't help saying, in fact, you have a way to avoid divine punishment. Go to watch net. When Li Yundong and Su Chan heard this, they immediately felt as if they had heard the sound of nature. At the same time they asked happily, what is it? Zi Yuan looked at him fixedly and said slowly, I will never reach the Xueqi phase. Ah! Li Yundong and Su Chan were shocked at the same time. Why? Because cultivation pursues immortality and transcends the shackles of birth, aging, illness, and death. Birth, aging, illness and death are the natural laws of all things in the world. Anyone who violates this law will be punished by heaven. Therefore, cultivation is the most heaven-defying thing in the world. When the accumulated energy of a cultivator reaches a certain level, it will naturally attract the heavenly thunder. This principle is the same as the taller a building is, the easier it is to be struck by lightning. Li Yundong suddenly understood and said, if I don't cultivate and don't build the foundation, I will never attract heavenly thunder. Zi Yuan's eyes flashed with admiration. She nodded and said, that's exactly what I mean. If you don't build your foundation, the heavenly lightning won't be able to find your aura and naturally won't strike you. But once you build your foundation, it will be equivalent to building a tall building on flat ground. The heavenly lightning will naturally have a target. Li Yundong asked in confusion, doesn't that mean that there are cultivators who are proficient in qi cultivating who use talismans to kill people without building their foundation? That way, they can endlessly avoid divine punishment? Zi Yuan said lightly, there are loopholes in any commandment or rule, let alone such a vast world. If the world is really strict and there are no loopholes, how can we cultivators become immortals? As she spoke, Zi Yuan glanced at Li Yundong and said meaningfully, however, once you set foot on the road of cultivation, it will be difficult for you to resist the desire and impulse to build your foundation. You have to understand that before and after the Xueqi phase are completely different. Before the Xueqi phase, you are just an ordinary person who is a little stronger than a mortal. But once you succeed in building your foundation, you will be a future immortal. You can go to heaven and earth, transcend the mortal world and become a saint. Li Yundong was fascinated by what Zi Yuan had said. He couldn't help but think of what Su Chan had said to him before. When you succeed in cultivation, we will travel the world together and have fun. How wonderful such a life would be. Su Chan held Li Yundong's arm worriedly, for fear that he would make up his mind to build his foundation and seek his own death. She begged in a sad voice, Yundong, it's okay if we don't build our foundation. We can hide in a place where no one can find us and live happily together. Let's go to the internet. 7K, Hong, Li Yundong suddenly smiled and said, then I'll be a virgin for the rest of my life, and you'll also be a virgin for the rest of your life. Su Chan couldn't help blushing, and the bitterness in her heart dissipated a lot because of Li Yundong's teasing. She said angrily, you're so annoying. What nonsense are you talking about? Her angry and happy appearance only moved the heart of a peerless beauty like Zi Yuan. She couldn't help but sigh. What a pitiful little fairy. No wonder Li Yundong is so obsessed with her. Zi Yuan pitied the true feelings of the two of them and couldn't help but say, as long as you don't build your foundation, at least you can live your next life in peace. But don't think about cultivation for the rest of your life. Su Chan's heart tightened. She took Li Yundong's arm and tried to persuade him again. Yundong, let's not build our foundation, okay? I'm so afraid that after you succeed, you will. Before she could finish her words, she suddenly heard a cold snort. The people of the Zhengyi school really only know how to come up with bad ideas. After so many years, you still haven't made any progress. Everyone was stunned and looked towards the direction of the voice, only to see a 3-feet-long green peak sword flying across the sky with a swoosh in the distance, emitting a faint white light. On the sword stood a graceful and elegant woman with long hair that reached her waist and a skirt that fluttered in the wind. As soon as Zi Yuan saw the woman, her body suddenly trembled and she couldn't help whispering, "The 3-feet-long sword is cold, and the hair is green. She is a romantic, and her heart has been haunted for several lives." Ruan Hongling widened her eyes and looked at the cold woman in front of her. She cried out involuntarily, "Sword immortal?" As she spoke, she turned her head and asked Zi Yuan in confusion, "Sister Zi Yuan, what are you talking about?" Zi Yuan's eyes were fixed on the woman, and her eyes suddenly became extremely distant and sad. "Do you still remember a line of poetry that Master once carved with a sword on the wind-dust stone?" Ruan Hongling's eyes widened and she stammered, You mean?" Zi Yuan's eyes fell on the long sword under the woman's feet. She sighed faintly and said, "Don't you think this sword is very familiar?" Ruan Hongling stared at the sword for a while with her eyes wide open. Suddenly she shouted in surprise, "This is Ba Huang. This is Master's sword. How could it be in her hand? Is she?" Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling stared at the woman. For a moment, it was as if they had seen an incredible person. They were so shocked that they couldn't speak. However, the woman didn't look at them. She just glanced at them, as if she didn't take them seriously at all. Instead, she just looked at Li Yundong seriously and then looked at Su Chan sternly. Su Chan also stared at her with her eyes wide open. Her face was full of surprise, joy and fear. She cried out involuntarily, "Master?" Almost at the same time, Ruan Hongling also cried out involuntarily. "You are the 7-tailed fox spirit of the Fox Zen school, Ao Wushuang? You're not dead?" Li Yundong was stunned. Ao Wushuang? Why was the name so cocky? However, she is the little girl's master, and the little girl is so powerful. She must be very arrogant, right? Li Yundong looked at the woman who had flown over on the sword seriously. He saw that the woman was extremely beautiful, even more so than Su Chan. She had a perfect oval face, small and enchanting. Her lips were like vermilion, and her skin was white as snow. The corners of her eyes were slightly raised, making her look proud and indifferent. However, there was a vermilion beauty mole between her eyebrows, which made her incomparably cold and elegant face lively, bright and charming. Li Yundong had seen the bright and lovely Su Chan, the dignified and generous Zhou Qin, the coquettish and sexy Chao Kefi, and the otherworldly beauty of Zi Yuan. When he saw Ao Wushuang again, he felt that the visual impact of this woman was the strongest. She clearly had a cold and arrogant face, but when ordinary people saw her, they felt that she was romantic and charming. Her eyes were obviously cold and vicissitudes of life, but they made people feel that she would smile sweetly at any time and steal their souls. "Is this your master?" Li Yundong couldn't help turning to look at Su Chan. Su Chan hid behind Li Yundong with some fear and nodded slightly. "Yes, this is my master. She must have come to find me." When Ao Wushuang heard her words, she sneered and said, "Do you still remember me as your master? Look at how much trouble you've caused in the mortal world." Li Yundong couldn't bear to hear others scolding his girl, even if this person was Su Chan's master. He blocked Su Chan with his body and said loudly, "She is very obedient and didn't cause any trouble. I caused the trouble here." Ao Wushuang looked Li Yundong up and down, snorted coldly, and her eyes were full of disdain. "What's the difference between what you did and what she did?" Li Yundong said loudly, "I will bear the consequences of my own actions. Of course, I will bear the consequences myself. It has nothing to do with Su Chan. Don't always involve her." Su Chan hid behind Li Yundong timidly. She was moved and sad at the same time. She couldn't help poking her head out and saying loudly, "No, this is the trouble I caused. Master, please punish me." The way the two of them were trying to exonerate each other made Ao Wushuang's eyes flash with a sad look, but she quickly regained her indifference. Can you two solve the problem by pushing it back and forth like this? Su Chan was stunned and couldn't help but have an idea. She shouted with joy, Master, you have a way to help Li Yundong get through the heavenly tribulation, right? You must have a way, right? Su Chan thought of her master's extraordinary ability. She was so powerful that she must have a way to help Li Yundong resolve the heavenly tribulation. The more she thought about it, the more excited she became. She couldn't help jumping out of Li Yundong's side and quickly running to Ao Wushuang's side. She pulled her sleeve and said sadly, Master, you must have a way. Please help Yundong. You can punish me in any way you want. Ao Wushuang was silent for a long time before she snorted coldly. Are you so sure that I have a way? Su Chan said anxiously, Master, your magic is so powerful. There must be a way, right? /om/. Chapter 159. Go to watch net. Ao Wushuang looked at the anxious Su Chan and sighed slightly in her heart, but her face was still as cold as frost. She snorted and said, Do you really think I'm an immortal? Do you really believe me when I say I have a way? You've been in the mortal world for so many days. How can you still be so childish? As she said this, she pointed at Li Yundong and said coldly, If this person had bad intentions and spoke sweet words to you, would you be fooled? Su Chan was shocked. No, Yundong is not such a person. He treats me very well. He. Su Chan saw that the look in her master's eyes was getting more and more strange, and her heart suddenly thumped. She unconsciously stepped back, wanting to run back to Li Yundong's side. Watch net. 7K. Oath M. However, when Ao Wushuang pointed her finger at Su Chan, she froze on the spot. Her body felt as if it weighed thousands of kilograms, and she couldn't move at all. Ao Wushuang sneered and said, You want to go back to him? Come with me obediently. Li Yundong was shocked. What are you doing? Let her go. When Ao Wushuang saw him rushing over, she pointed at him with her finger. Suddenly, Li Yundong felt as if he had been handcuffed by an extremely heavy chain. Even though he had amazing divine strength, he was like traveling monk's son being pressed under the 5 elements mountain, unable to move at all. What's going on? Li Yundong couldn't imagine that such a peerless beauty would be able to stop him with just a light touch from such a proud and arrogant woman. Don't make things difficult for her. If you have something to say, come at me. Li Yundong roared. You. Ao Wushuang sneered. What can you do? After that, Ao Wushuang suddenly pinched her fingers and shouted, 8 desolations. With that, the 8 desolation celestial sword under her feet suddenly disappeared and then reappeared in front of her in an instant. The body of the sword made a buzzing sound. Ao Wushuang pointed at Li Yundong and shouted, Can you stop it? As soon as her voice fell, the Bahuang sword made a clanging sound and instantly turned into countless 3-feet-long green peak swords, like a lotus blooming in an instant. The layers of petals were blades that rotated rapidly. They were incomparably sharp, and the friction made a sizzling sound. The iron lotus rushed towards Li Yundong like a bolt of lightning. Su Chan was scared out of her wits. No, she screamed. Li Yundong only felt his vision go black, and the iron lotus instantly rushed over. But when it rushed in front of him, it stopped in an instant, like countless whirlpools of blades that were constantly rotating, shrouding his eyes and making a terrible sound of metal friction. Li Yundong had no doubt that if this iron lotus with a diameter of 2 to 3 meters pounced on him, he would immediately be turned into countless pieces of flesh and blood. Li Yundong was shocked. He had never seen such magic and means. Just when Li Yundong thought that Ao Wushuang was going to kill him, there was suddenly nothing in front of him. The steel lotus composed of countless Bahuang swords was like a blooming flower closing into a flower bud. The sword edges closed one by one, and then quickly turned into a 3-foot-long green sword. Watch net. The green sword paused in front of Li Yundong for a moment, allowing him to clearly see the 2 antique seal scripts engraved on it, Bahuang. Then the Bahuang sword disappeared in an instant and returned to Ao Wushuang's feet in an instant. Ao Wushuang said proudly, What do you think? Li Yundong sneered and said loudly without changing his expression, Do you think you can scare me like this? If you have the ability, kill me. Otherwise, even if I die, I will die with Su Chan. Ao Wushuang suddenly became furious. She raised her hand, and countless green vines suddenly grew out of Li Yundong's feet, entangling him tightly. At first, these green vines were only as thick as a little finger. They grew from Li Yundong's feet and climbed all the way up his calves. Soon, when they climbed to his thighs, they became as thick as a thumb. When they climbed to his waist, they had grown as thick as a forearm. When they reached his chest, they were as thick as a thigh. Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan watched in shock as the green vine grew wildly into the sky. In an instant, it entangled Li Yundong. They knew that as long as Ao Wushuang thought about it, Li Yundong would be strangled to death. But soon, Ao Wushuang pointed at the green vine again. In an instant, a flame ignited on the tip of her finger, and then the green vine began to burn. Li Yundong, who was bound by the vines, felt that he was suffocated by the tight vines. Just as he was about to shout, he suddenly felt a burning pain coming from all around him. Is this woman going to burn me to death? Li Yundong was shocked. This is not a good way to die. But just as he was about to be burned to death, the green vines around him suddenly burst open, and the flames attached to the green vines splashed everywhere. Go to CNET. 7K. Oath M. Colorful * rainbow * literature under learning % super #speed. Before Li Yundong could take a breath, he suddenly felt that the sky had suddenly darkened. He looked up subconsciously and saw a huge rock coming at him. In the blink of an eye, it was over his head. Just as a trace of fear flashed in Li Yundong's eyes, the huge rock suddenly stopped an inch above his head with a loud bang. Li Yundong fixed his eyes and saw that there was a stream of water that was as thick as a finger flowing above his head. It was like a shield, forcibly carrying the huge rock falling from the sky. With a wave of Ao Wushuang's hand, the water shield shook violently and threw the huge rock away. With a muffled thud, it hit the ground, creating a deep pit. Ruan Hongling and Zi Yuan were stunned. Ruan Hongling said, "She's actually proficient in the 5 elements of magic at the same time? Isn't this too exaggerated?" Zi Yuan was also secretly shocked. This series of attacks is as fast as lightning. After making a move, she immediately takes it back. Her methods are so fast that it's really too much for the eyes to take in. Even I can't resist it. Ao Wushuang is indeed worthy of being the top master of the Fox Zen school. Li Yundong seemed to have been stunned by the series of attacks just now. He stood there in a daze, unable to come to his senses for a while. Ao Wushuang shouted angrily, "I have more than 100 kinds of shentong that can kill you in an instant. Just now, I only showed you 5 of them. Even a cultivator like me has to fear the heavenly tribulation and don't dare to get into trouble. You're just an uncultured brat. How dare you drag my beloved disciple into this mess with you?" As she spoke, Ao Wushuang seemed to recall something from the past. A look of extreme pain flashed in her eyes. She scolded loudly, "Don't think that you're great just because you're the successor of Jin Dan. You haven't even stepped into the threshold of cultivation. You're still very young. If you don't have the ability, don't try to be a hero. And don't get me, my disciple, into trouble." Ao Wushuang's series of attacks had made Li Yundong unable to fight back at all. This kind of shame and humiliation made him unable to react for a while. But then Ao Wushuang's scolding suddenly made his heart tremble. Su Chan had already burst into tears. Su Chan had already burst into tears. She struggled frantically and cried, "Master, don't take me away. I want to be with Yundong." Ao Wushuang scolded loudly, "Shut up. What good will it be for you to be with him? When the divine punishment comes, you will also be struck to death. Do you know that?" Su Chan cried, "If I die, I die. I'm willing to die with Yundong." Ao Wushuang was so angry that she scolded, "You're really crazy and obsessed." Li Yundong raised his head and let out a long sigh. He advised Su Chan, "Su Chan, listen to your master and go by yourself." Ao Wushuang snorted coldly and said, "At least you've said something reasonable." Then she pulled Su Chan's arm and was about to leave. Su Chan staggered because of Ao Wushuang's pull. She cried and looked back at Li Yundong with tears in her eyes. Zi Yuan, who was standing to one side, suddenly said, "Senior Wushuang." Ao Wushuang glanced at her coldly and said, "What? Do you want to meddle in the family affairs of our Fox Zen school?" Zi Yuan cupped her hands and said, "I don't dare. I just want to ask, This Bahuang sword is the most precious treasure of our Zhengyi school's Linggong sect. When will you return it to our sect? In addition, our second Sherbua visited your sect 9 years ago, but there has been no news of her whereabouts. I wonder if Senior knows anything about it. Ao Wushuang laughed and said, "Are you talking about your master Shimmy? How would I know her whereabouts? In addition, this Bahuang sword, hee little girl, if you have the ability, come and take it yourself." As she said this, she pulled Su Chan and turned into a beam of green light in the blink of an eye. Ruan Hongling watched her leave and stamped her feet angrily. This witch is really domineering. Zi Yuan shook her head and looked at Li Yundong. She saw that the boy seemed to have lost his soul. He stood there in a daze, motionless like a stone statue. Although Ruan Hongling had had friction with Li Yundong before, she still couldn't bear to see him like this. She felt sour in her heart. She nudged Zi Yuan with her elbow and whispered, "Sister Zi Yuan, heave." Zi Yuan shook her head and said, "Everything is predestined." As she spoke, she suddenly thought of something and quickly said to Ruan Hongling, "There must have been a lot of secular mortals who saw this scene just now. Hurry up and deal with it." Ruan Hongling was also shocked. She looked around and saw that the people who had been pointing at them had fallen to the ground. She quickly rushed over and saw that these people had all fainted on the ground. There was a big tree lying across the road 2 or 3 miles away, blocking the traffic. Only then did Ruan Hongling feel convinced. Ao Wushuang's magical power is amazing, but it's really rare to see such a meticulous mind. Ao Wushuang took Su Chan and flew more than 10 miles away. She saw that Su Chan, who was beside her, had been silent, instead of crying like before. She was surprised and turned her head to take a look. She was shocked and slapped Su Chan on the back, scolding, "You're crazy. How dare you destroy your own meridians?" Su Chan spat out a mouthful of blood. She wanted to commit suicide but failed, so she burst into tears and said, "If you want to take me away, I'd rather die." Ao Wushuang said angrily, "What's so good about that man? Why are you so infatuated with him?" Su Chan said with tears streaming down her face, "Yundong is the person who treats me the best in the world." As she spoke, she told him everything that had happened between her and Li Yundong. Even the trivial things like her playing behind his back and Li Yundong buying her an ice cream were all clearly told. The more she spoke, the more Su Chan cried. After that she cried loudly and said, "After I left him last time, I felt that although the world was big, there was no place for me to go. Although there were many people in the world, there was no one worthy of my love. When I was by his side, I felt happy. Even if I drank a glass of cold water, I would feel sweet and warm. When I wasn't by his side, I felt that the sky was going to collapse and the earth was going to sink. There was no longer any joy in this world." Ao Wushuang was stunned when she heard this. She seemed to remember her own sad things and couldn't help but cry slowly. She hugged Su Chan and sighed in a trembling voice. "Silly girl, didn't I tell you that the most bitter thing in the world is love? Your master has suffered a lot in his life. Why do you want to repeat my mistakes?" Su Chan wiped away her tears and said in a sad voice, "Love is bitter, but if you taste the sweetness in it, you will understand that the sweetest thing in the world is love. In order to taste the sweetness in it, no matter how much pain you suffer, it is worth it." As she said this, Su Chan took Ao Wushuang's hand and begged bitterly, "Master, I beg you, let me go back to Yundong. Without him, I really can't live." Ao Wushuang let out a long sigh and stroked Su Chan's hair lovingly. "Silly girl, do you really think I want to take you away from him?" When Su Chan heard this, it seemed that there was a turning point. She was immediately surprised and happy. "Master, what do you mean, /om/?" Chapter 160. Go to Watch Network. Ao Wushuang sighed and said, "I'm not blind. How can I not see the love between you and him? But because you have such a deep relationship with him, I must take you away." Su Chan asked in surprise why. Ao Wushuang said, "You've already tried to build the Zhuji phase with him, haven't you?" Su Chan was shocked again. "Master, did you find us a long time ago?" Ao Wushuang shook her head and said, "I've been paying attention to you for a long time. I didn't want to interfere in your affairs, but when I saw you fail for the first time, I made up my mind to take you away." Su Chan said loudly, "Why?" "Master, with your help, He will definitely succeed in building the Xueqi phase. Ao Wushuang couldn't help but say angrily, "Nonsense. The Xueqi phase depends on yourself. How can you let others help you? In this way, even if you successfully refine the Niden, it will be a fake Niden. Once you meet a master, you will definitely be vulnerable. You and him are together all day long, and your feelings for each other are deep and true. Sex is like karma. Once a person is in love, how can he not be aroused?" Hearing this, Su Chan couldn't help blushing. She lowered her head, tugged at the corner of her clothes with her fingers, and didn't say anything. "Go to the watch net." Ao Wushuang snorted coldly and said, "He still wants to build the Xueqi phase? In his next life." Only then did Su Chan know that her master had taken her away from Li Yundong because her existence had always made Li Yundong feel aroused and unable to build the Xueqi phase. The resentment in her heart gradually disappeared. She raised her head, her face as red as an apple, and said timidly, "Then when he succeeds in building the Xueqi phase, what should we do when the divine punishment comes?" Ao Wushuang thought for a while and said, "I'll think of a way then." Su Chan was ecstatic. She took Ao Wushuang's hand and shook it hard, saying loudly, "Master, I know that you are the person who treats me the best in the world. You must help Yundong. He is very smart and talented." He visualized the 99 Lotus Throne for the first time. Ao Wushuang smiled and said, "Why? Isn't your lover the best person in the world? Why did I suddenly become the best person to you?" Su Chan was embarrassed and said coquettishly, "Master." Ao Wushuang showed a rare expression of appreciation and said, "What did you just say?" He was able to visualize 9 lotus platforms on his first try. "The first time I saw him, I felt that his potential was extraordinary, and that he might be a rare genius that only appears once in 100 years. Who would have thought that he would be a genius that only appears once in 500 years? Su Chan couldn't help raising her head proudly, as if Ao Wushuang was praising her. She said, yes, Yundong is the smartest. Master, you teach him. He's not as stupid as me. I'm sure he'll be able to learn once he learns." Ao Wushuang shook her head and said, "I can't teach him." Su Chan said anxiously, "Master, you know so many magical skills. Why can't you teach them?" Ao Wushuang sighed and said, "I know my own abilities. Although I'm known as the top master of the Fox Zen school, I can only do so much. What I've learned is too much, and I'm not good at it. If I teach him, it will only be a waste of his precious talent." Su Chan looked at Ao Wushuang eagerly. "Then who can teach you?" Ao Wushuang said, "Didn't you just see it? It's so far away but so close." Su Chan was stunned and said involuntarily, "You mean?" Ao Wushuang smiled, and her eyes suddenly became very distant. "More than 10 years ago, my enemy told me about this." Su Chan was confused and asked in confusion, "What is it?" Ao Wushuang shook her head with a pained look in her eyes. "Forget it. It's been a long time. Don't mention it. Go to the internet." 7K. Oath M. Don't worry about your lover. He has his own good fortune. As long as he can successfully build the Xueqi phase and survive the divine tribulation, his achievements will be limitless, and he will definitely far surpass me. I can also leave you to him with peace of mind. Su Chan's face was full of joy at first, but when she heard the last sentence, she couldn't help but ask anxiously, "Master, you don't want me anymore?" Ao Wushuang laughed and said, "One moment you hate me, and the next moment you're afraid that I don't want you anymore. Channer, you really change so fast." Su Chan lowered her head shyly, but soon she raised it again and asked weakly, "Master, can I say goodbye to Yundong? If I leave like this, with his character and temper, he will definitely go to extremes. I'm afraid that he will take it too hard." Ao Wushuang stared at Su Chan and sighed deeply. "What an idiot. You go, lest he holds a grudge against me. Maybe in the future." Su Chan asked, "In the future what?" Ao Wushuang shook her head and said, "Nothing. Go ahead and come back quickly." Su Chan responded and turned into a beam of cyan light. But soon she came back and looked at Ao Wushuang eagerly. "Master, can you give me the powerful magical weapon you promised me?" Ao Wushuang was shocked. "You really spent a lot of money for your lover. You actually want to give him the most precious treasure of our Fox Zen school?" After she finished speaking, she immediately sighed and said, "Forget it. Anyway, no one in our Fox Zen school can use this powerful magical weapon now. Just give it to him. As she said this, she took out a colorful brocade pouch from her side and handed it to Su-chan. She then warned, "Go and come back quickly. Don't be sentimental. Don't delay his cultivation. If you do that, you will lose more than you gain." Su-chan nodded heavily and then quickly turned into a beam of cyan light and left. "Go to the net." After Su-chan left, Li Yundong felt as if his chest had been hollowed out. His whole body was empty, and he had no strength at all. His 3 souls and 7 spirits were not in his body, and he was like a walking corpse. But suddenly, he saw a beam of cyan light fly back in the blink of an eye. A beautiful girl with a sweet smile stood in front of him and looked at him with a smile. Li Yundong took a closer look. Who else could it be but Su-chan? At this moment, Li Yundong felt as if he had come back to his senses. His previously empty chest was suddenly full, and his heart was so happy that it seemed to explode. He said in a trembling voice, "Girl, you're back?" Su-chan had originally come to see Li Yundong with joy, but when she saw Li Yundong's appearance, she suddenly felt sad. She couldn't help crying and throwing herself into Li Yundong's arms. "Master, I missed you. Why did you come back?" Li Yundong hugged Su-chan tightly, and tears welled up in his eyes. He wiped them away and said with a smile. The two of them held hands and looked at each other with tears in their eyes, crying and laughing at the same time. Su-chan wiped away her tears and also smiled. "My master asked me to come back." Li Yundong seemed to be unable to believe his ears. He was surprised and happy. "Your master? She won't take you away?" Su-chan shook her head and told Li Yundong what Ao Wushuang had told her before. Then she looked at Li Yundong in a daze and said, "Yundong, I'm not here. You can focus on the Xueqi phase by yourself. When you succeed in the Xueqi phase and get through the thunder tribulation, I'll come to find you." Li Yundong couldn't help but let out a long sigh. "Your master is right. I'm still too weak. I'm so weak that I can't even protect myself. How can I protect you?" Su-chan said loudly, "Although you are weak now, you will definitely be a first-class master in the world in the future." Li Yundong was moved and nodded hard. "Well, I will definitely work hard." The two of them looked at each other and smiled. Neither of them talked about how to get through the heavens tribulation after the Xueqi phase. It was as if once they reached the Xueqi phase, the heavens tribulation would not be a problem. Su-chan nestled in Li Yundong's arms and greedily sniffed his scent. After a while, she remembered something. She took out the 7 treasures brocade pouch she carried with her and patted it. In the blink of an eye, the 7 treasures brocade pouch emitted a burst of colorful light, which was so dazzling that Li Yundong subconsciously covered his eyes with his hands. But after the light disappeared, Li Yundong saw that Su-chan was holding a large black iron fan that was nearly as tall as a person. The fan was black all over and seemed to be made of iron. It was about 1.6 meters long, and each fan blade was nearly 10 centimeters long. A person with small hands would not be able to hold it with one hand. Su-chan held the big iron fan and handed it to Li Yundong. She said, "Yundong, this is for you. In the future, keep it for self-defense." Li Yundong took the big iron fan in surprise. As soon as he held it in his hand suddenly sank. He was shocked. "So heavy?" Su-chan said seriously, "This is a magical item passed down by the founder of our Fox Zen school, the Rock Fox. It's called the Fan of 7 Treasures. In the past, our founder, the Rock Ancestor, relied on this powerful magical weapon to defeat countless experts." Li Yunyang looked at the treasured fan and saw that there were countless golden Sanskrit characters engraved on the surface of the iron fan. He was shocked and suddenly remembered that the immovable Wisdom King with 3 heads and 6 arms was holding a magical item in his hand. Wasn't it this treasured fan? Seeing that Li Yundong was in a daze, Su-chan thought that he was embarrassed to accept such a powerful magical item, so she said anxiously, "You are strong, so it's convenient for you to use. There are many women in our Fox Zen school, so we can't use it. So, it's a waste for us to keep it. It's useful for you to take it." Li Yundong came to his senses, nodded, and said, "Then I won't stand on ceremony." Seeing that he had accepted it, Su-chan immediately beamed with joy. "Why are you being so polite to me?" Li Yundong also smiled and said, Yes, my girl's things are also my things, aren't they? Su-chan suddenly thought of something and said coquettishly, no, my piggy bank is still mine. You can't touch it when I'm not here. Li Yundong thought of the past and couldn't help laughing. Okay, I won't touch it. When you put the key in, did you expect that you would be away for a while? Were you afraid that I would steal your money? Su-chan wanted to laugh when she heard this, but when she thought that she would be away from Li Yundong for a period of time, she felt sad. She pouted and couldn't help tearing up again. I don't want to be away from you for even a second. Li Yundong also forced a smile and said, it's okay. It won't be long. Maybe I'll come to see you in a few days. Su-chan wiped her tears and forced a smile. Well, when I'm not here, remember to miss me. Li Yundong held the fan of 7 treasures with one hand and held the girl's waist with the other. He kissed her gently on the lips and said, I will miss you every second. Su-chan seemed to have thought of something. She waved her hand in panic and said, No, you can't think of me when you're in the Xueqi phase. After that, she added, you can't think of me before you reach the Xueqi phase either. The girl couldn't help but say with a wronged and sad face, you can't miss me before. It's better to think about me after you finish the Xueqi phase. Li Yundong took Su-chan's hand and pressed it against his chest. He looked into her eyes and said, you are already in my heart. How can I not miss you every second? Su-chan's eyes suddenly became misty with tears. She threw herself into Li Yundong's arms again and sobbed. She held his waist with both hands and refused to let go. But at this moment, Ao Wushuang's cold voice sounded in Su-chan's mind. Su-chan, do you want to hurt him? Su-chan jumped up in fright and struggled out of Li Yundong's arms in a panic. But she only took 2 steps before she stopped in her tracks. She turned around and looked at Li Yundong. Sir, she said. I'm leaving. Li Yundong forced a smile and said, well, when you are alone, don't cook by yourself. Su-chan wanted to laugh, but she couldn't stop her tears from falling. She nodded and wiped them away. Then, she gritted her teeth and turned around to leave. But after taking 2 steps, she stopped again. She turned her head and said with tears in her eyes, Sir, I will miss you. Li Yundong also smiled with tears in his eyes and said, I will miss you too. Su-chan turned her head, wiped her tears, and walked with her head down. She took 2 steps and looked back. After walking for 20 or 30 meters, she suddenly stopped and turned around. She made a trumpet with her hands around her mouth and shouted, Yundong, you must become stronger. After shouting, she instantly turned into a green light and disappeared on the spot. Li Yundong's tears suddenly burst out of his eyes, and he choked with sobs. He stood where he was and raised his head, as if he was trying hard to hold back his tears. After looking up for a long time, Li Yundong lowered his head and also made a trumpet with his hands around his mouth. He said loudly, I will definitely become stronger. This shout spread far and wide in the wilderness of the suburbs. The sky was dignified and cold, and the earth was heavy and silent. Between heaven and earth, this shout echoed without dispersing, as if it was witnessing this young man's vow and determination. I'll say a few words about the book here. I'll have to trouble all of you to take a look at it. Perhaps someone would say, little fox is gone. When will she come back? She won't come back until the end, right? My answer is, no, she will come back soon. She will appear from time to time in the middle of the story. She is another line, and without her, the cultivation world cannot be lured out. Perhaps someone would say, the main character will start to level up and slowly leave the city. Yes, the main character will enter the cultivation world, but he will not leave the city. This is a city book first, and then the cultivation world. Don't worry, the main character will return soon. Also, some people say that the book is good, some people say that it is exciting, and some people say that it is not good. Of course you can choose not to read it, right? Let's part on good terms. What I want to say is, this is just the beginning of the story. The real exciting part comes later. Li Yundong has just set foot on the road of cultivation. He needs to go from weak to strong. A wonderful and magnificent story has just begun. /om/ Chapter 161. Go to Watch Network. Li Yundong stood there in a daze. looking in the direction in which Su-chan had left. Although he was sad in his heart, it was much better than the pain he had felt when Su-chan had left. Besides feeling disappointed, Lee Yundong's heart was filled with the will and determination to work hard to become stronger. Go to the internet. 7K. Lee Yundong stood there in a daze for a while. He walked up to Zhou Qin and sighed slightly. I'm sorry I got you involved. Zhou Qin's eyes moved. She stared at Lee Yundong and sighed softly. What do you want to do next? Lee Yundong thought for a moment and shook his head. I don't know. I want to turn myself in, but I can't because Su-chan is still waiting for me. Zhou Qin suddenly smiled helplessly. Don't turn yourself in. Even if you turn yourself in, you won't be convicted because there are no witnesses and no physical evidence. Even if there are traffic videos on the road that can capture you chasing after young Master He, that can't be used as evidence to convict you. I stopped you from doing it before because I was afraid that you would be involved in a murder case. If you kill him yourself, you won't be able to see the sun for the rest of your life. Even if you hide abroad, you won't stop. The forces behind young Master He won't let you go, Zhou Qin said. But if you kill him with lightning, that's another matter. As she spoke, Zhou Qin looked at the big pit where young Master He had disappeared. She said with a complicated expression, I really didn't expect that you would be able to attract lightning to kill him. Did you make up your mind from the beginning? Lee Yundong shook his head. I was just thinking, he said. Since God doesn't want to use lightning to strike this man to death, then I'll use it to avenge Deng Yu, Deng Jiao, Lu, and his mother. Zhou Qin took a deep breath, as if she had made up her mind. I got it. You don't have to worry about this matter. I'll settle it. Can you do it? Lee Yundong raised his head and looked at Zhou Qin worriedly. Zhou Qin smiled faintly and said, There is no such thing as no in my dictionary. Lee Yundong smiled. You're always so domineering. Zi Yuan, who was standing to one side, said, The police will be here soon. Lee Yundong, come with us first. Since you want to choose the path of cultivation, you must remember not to get involved in lawsuits and cases. This is a great taboo for cultivation. Lee Yundong glanced at Zi Yuan, as if he couldn't understand why she was helping him like this. However, he also knew that it was definitely not a good thing for him to stay here, so he nodded and said, Can you take me away? Zi Yuan sighed in her heart. Master's words have come true. Even if I want to ignore you, it's impossible. She said softly, Give me your hand. Watch net. 7K. M. Lee Yundong stretched out his hand in confusion. Zi Yuan stretched out a hand and gently placed it on his wrist. Her fingers were slender and white, and her wrist was as white as snow. Zi Yuan turned her head and asked Zhou Qin, Do you want to go with me? Zhou Qin shook her head. No, I'll wait here for the police to come. Someone has to deal with these things. Zi Yuan said worriedly, You should know what you can say and what you can't, right? Zhou Qin's eyes were fixed on Lee Yundong. She smiled faintly and said, Do I need you to teach me this? Zi Yuan didn't care about the offense in Zhou Qin's words. She nodded slightly and said, That's good. Then she whispered, Let's go. Lee Yundong only felt his body suddenly become light, and in an instant, he flew up. He didn't even have time to close his eyes before he found that white clouds were flashing under his feet. The buildings on the vast land were as small as black dots. Lee Yundong was shocked. Before he could speak, he suddenly felt his feet sink again, and he suddenly stepped on the ground. Zi Yuan said softly, We're here. Lee Yundong looked around and saw that he was surrounded by pavilions and stone benches, and in the distance was a high-rise apartment. It was the Hongxing New area where he lived. Lee Yundong looked at this familiar place and for a moment, he felt a little sad. He remembered that when he and the little girl had just moved in, they had met Ruan Hongling here. After meeting this bitch, his life had been completely messed up. Watch net. Lee Yundong stood there in a daze for a while, sighing slightly in his heart. Then, he walked home alone in silence. Ruan Hongling saw that he had turned around and left without saying a word of thanks. She was so angry that she stamped her feet. Doesn't this person know how to say thank you? Zi Yuan looked at Lee Yundong's lonely back and sighed softly. Forget it. Don't hug a sad person. Besides, these things have something to do with us more or less. It's better to squash enmity than keep it alive. Ruan Hongling snorted, turned her face away, and didn't speak. After Li Yundong returned home with the big iron fan, he looked around and found that this familiar place had suddenly become so strange. It was almost evening, and the sky was slowly getting dark. Lights were on in every house, but his house was still dark. Li Yundong put the big iron fan against the door and stood in the living room for a while. Then, he pushed open Su Chan's door and stood in her room for a while. Then, he stood in each room for a short while. He closed his eyes and recalled every place and every bit of Su Chan here. It was like this could gather infinite power, allowing him to overcome the first and most important hurdle on the road of cultivation, Xueqi phase. Li Yundong walked around the room and finally stood in Su Chan's room for a long time. Then, he returned to the living room. According to what Su Chan had taught him, he opened all the windows and curtains of the balcony and living room to ensure ventilation and lighting. Then, he sat cross-legged in the living room, facing the east, ready to meditate. But as soon as he sat down and closed his eyes, he heard a clear voice. "What are you doing?" Li Yundong opened his eyes and saw Wan Hongling sitting on the balcony in front of him, looking at him with her legs crossed and her head tilted. Li Yundong subconsciously blamed Wan Hongling for Su Chan's departure. In addition, she had hurt Su Chan, so he didn't like her very much. Naturally, he didn't have a good face. He said coldly, "What does it have to do with you? I want to build the Xueqi phase. Please leave here and don't disturb me." Wan Hongling felt Li Yundong's hostility. She snorted coldly and said disdainfully, "You want to build the Xueqi phase like this? Let me tell you, if you build the Xueqi phase like this, it will be strange if you don't go crazy." Li Yundong didn't believe her words. He sneered and said, "What does it have to do with you if I go crazy?" Although Wan Hongling had a grudge against Li Yundong, she found that this boy had a chivalrous heart and extraordinary courage. He would rather suffer divine punishment than enforce justice on behalf of heaven. She couldn't help but feel that she might have indeed misjudged him in the past. She admired him even more, so she came to remind him out of kindness. But when Wan Hongling saw that Li Yundong was so kind, she suddenly became furious and said, "How can you bite the hand that feeds you? You don't know how to appreciate my kindness." Li Yundong sneered and said, "Are you a good person? If you were really a good person, you wouldn't have hurt Su Chan indiscriminately, and you wouldn't have." Wan Hongling was so angry that she jumped off the edge of the balcony without waiting for Li Yundong to finish speaking. She said angrily, Well, I came to advise you with good intentions, but you actually taught me a lesson. Come on, today I want to see whether your Jindan's Yuanqi is more powerful or my Jingyi Zhenqi is more powerful." Li Yundong immediately stood up and sneered, "Well, I was just looking for someone to vent my anger on." Seeing that the two of them were about to fight, Zi Yuan suddenly appeared between them. The ethereal woman sighed slightly and said helplessly, "You two must have been enemies from 500 years ago. Why are you quarreling as soon as you meet?" Wan Hongling snorted and turned her face away. Li Yundong also snorted and looked at Zi Yuan. "Are you also here to teach me a lesson?" Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong, who had a strong rebellious mentality. She sighed softly and said, "I know you are uncomfortable in your heart. You want to succeed in the Xueqi phase immediately. Then go through the divine tribulation and find your Su Chan. I also hope that you can successfully build the Xueqi phase and pass the divine tribulation. But you have to know one thing." Zi Yuan's voice was soft and gentle, and there was an indescribable calmness and peace in her tone, which made the depression and anger in Li Yundong's heart slowly dissipate, and his state of mind also calmed down. He was depressed for a while, then said in a low voice, "What is it?" Zi Yuan said softly, "Haste makes waste. Look at your current situation. Your heart is full of entanglement, sadness, anxiety, and anger. These are all taboo in cultivation." Li Yundong was not a person who could not listen to words. When he heard this, he immediately fell into silence and did not say a word. Zi Yuan continued, "Cultivators must maintain a calm and peaceful state of mind. Only when you are in a state of no self, no everything, no other, and no world can you enter the senseless state of having all 6 roots broken. Only then can you succeed in the Xueqi phase." Li Yundong took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Does that mean that if I adjust my mentality, I can succeed in the Xueqi phase?" Zi Yuan shook her head slightly and smiled faintly. "Although your body has been transformed by the Renyuan Jindan and you have a powerful Jindan Qi as your foundation, It is reasonable to say that as long as you stay focused, it should not be difficult for you to reach the Xueqi phase. However, although your cultivation speed is extremely fast, it is all a shortcut. It is not the right way. Therefore, although the qi you have cultivated is huge, your dantian has not been consolidated, and your foundation is not solid. Li Yundong couldn't help but say with some dissatisfaction, "Are you saying that my foundation is not solid?" As he spoke, he glanced at Ruan Hongling, as if to say, "If my foundation is not solid, why did your shimmy run away when she saw me?" When Li Yundong glanced at her, Ruan Hongling suddenly flew into a rage. "Why are you looking at me? If it weren't for the fact that the attribute of your Jindan Qi is the opposite of mine, would I be afraid of you?" Li Yundong sneered and was about to speak when he saw Zi Yuan waving her hand to Ruan Hongling. Then, Zi Yuan gently pinched her fingers, and in the blink of an eye, a round stone slab about 1 meter in diameter flew in from outside the balcony. This stone slab was about 2 inches thick and was made of marble. It was very hard. Li Yundong recognized it at a glance. "Isn't this the top of the stone table in the pavilion of the community? This woman can get this stone slab with a wave of her hand? What kind of magic is this?" Zi Yuan pressed the stone slab with one hand, faced Li Yundong, and said, "Try punching it." Last week, he ranked 9th on the list of flowers. This week, there were 2 updates, on Tuesday and Saturday. This is the first update today. /om/. Chapter 162. Go to watch net. Li Yundong glanced at Zi Yuan and hesitated for a moment. "Here." Zi Yuan nodded. "Take 3 steps back and then hit this slate with your qi. Don't worry, with your current qi and level of use, you won't be able to break this slate. Go to watch net. 7K. OM. Li Yundong was secretly upset by Zi Yuan's somewhat contemptuous words. He didn't say anything and took 3 steps back. Then, he lowered his eyebrows and shoulders and stood in a bow stance. He took a deep breath and then with a loud shout, he punched the stone slab. This punch poured out all the depression and anger in Li Yundong's body, and it burst out like a flood. A powerful qi hit the slate with a bang, causing the floor to tremble. Ruan Hongling, who was standing to one side, looked down and saw that there was a sunken pit on the surface of the slate. The pit was slightly shaped like a fist, and the pit was surrounded by dense cracks. Amazing. He hasn't even reached the Xueqi phase, yet he has such a powerful qi. Ruan Hongling was secretly shocked. What will happen if he succeeds in the Xueqi phase? However, Zi Yuan's face was calm. She turned the slate over and let it stand on its own. Then she walked to Li Yundong's side, keeping the same distance from him, and said, "Watch carefully." After that, she didn't use much qi and pushed out her palm. There was a muffled bang, and the slate, which had no one holding it, only trembled slightly. Li Yundong almost sneered in his heart. He thought to himself, "You didn't even knock down the slate. Now you're going to make a fool of yourself." Zi Yuan seemed to know what Li Yundong was thinking, so she said to him, "Don't laugh in such a hurry. Let's go closer and see the difference between the 2 sides." At first, Li Yundong didn't think much of it, but when he looked at the 2 sides of the slate, he was stunned. Then, he carefully and attentively compared the differences between the 2 sides of the slate. The more he looked, the more shocked he became, and the more cold sweat he broke out. He saw that the surface of the slate that Zi Yuan's palm had hit had a clear dent, and there was no trace of a crack beside the palm mark. It was as if someone had carefully chiseled a palm mark. How did he do this? Li Yundong felt that his head was full of question marks. It was incredible to the extreme. Zi Yuan said softly, "You must feel very strange. Why is the effect of my fight so different from yours?" Li Yundong nodded involuntarily. Watch net. 7K. OM. Zi Yuan said, "On the one hand, my aura is more feminine, while yours is more fierce. Therefore, my aura is mainly permeating, while yours is mainly destructive. That's why when you see the fist print and the palm print, one has a crack and the other doesn't." Li Yundong suddenly understood and nodded. Zi Yuan continued, "But what I want you to see is not this, but this. Your fist mark is small, so the aura will be more concentrated, but why is it not as clear as my palm mark on the slate?" Li Yundong was shocked and fell into deep thought. Zi Yuan said, This is because my aura is more solid than yours, and my basic skills are more solid than yours. Only then did Li Yundong believe Zi Yuan's words. He sighed and said, I've only been practicing qi for about a month. How can I compare to a master like you, who has been practicing qi in his mother's womb? Zi Yuan shook her head and said, with the help of Renyuan Jindan, your aura is so huge that it has already surpassed those of us who have been practicing qi for more than 10 years. What you need to do is to compress and condense the huge aura in your body. From a scientific point of view, no matter how great the pressure is, it is not as good as the pressure. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He understood what Zi Yuan meant. The damage caused by a fist with 100 kilograms of strength was definitely not as good as that of a finger with 25 kilograms of strength. Seeing Li Yundong's thoughtful expression, Zi Yuan said, if you can't cultivate your aura to be condensed like a needle, then when you reach the Zhuji phase, your Niden will not be strong enough and will easily become a fake one. Once you meet a strong opponent, you may be beaten until your Niden dissipates, not to mention the terrible divine tribulation. Hearing Zi Yuan's clear explanation, Li Yundong was finally convinced. He asked seriously, then what should I do to cultivate the aura in my body to be condensed like a needle? Zi Yuan smiled and said, you have to learn from the beginning. When Li Yundong heard this, he suddenly gasped. Learn from the beginning? No way. Zi Yuan asked in return, do you know why there is qi in your body? Do you know where your aura comes from? Do you know why you want to cultivate? Do you know how you cultivate? Do you know what the most important thing about cultivation is? Do you know what the role of the human body's essence, qi, blood, and internal organs in cultivation? Where does one's magic power come from? This series of rhetorical questions made Li Yundong dumbfounded. He smiled bitterly and said, I really don't know. But I don't have time to learn these things now. Zi Yuan smiled and said, sharpening the knife will not delay the work of cutting firewood. I recommend you to read a supreme book in the cultivation world. You will understand all the truth after reading it. Go to the internet. 7K. O.M. Li Yundong's heart was moved, and he couldn't help but look happy. What supreme book? Zi Yuan didn't answer Li Yundong first. She just said to Ruan Hongling, it's not good for us to fly around all the time. If the elders of other sects see us, they will definitely teach us a lesson. Go to the garage downstairs to get the car. We'll take him to buy books later. Ruan Hongling responded, glanced at Li Yundong, snorted, opened the door and walked out. Li Yundong watched Ruan Hongling go out. He withdrew his gaze and asked in confusion, buy books? You can even buy such a peerless treasure? Zi Yuan smiled and said, of course, and it can be bought everywhere. Li Yundong was stunned, as if he had heard the news of aliens attacking the earth. He said, since it is the supreme book of the cultivation world, shouldn't it be very precious? Why can it be bought everywhere? Zi Yuan smiled and said, the great sound is silent, and the great way is invisible. Our Taoism has declined so far. The world thinks that cultivation is a vague and boundless thing. They either dismiss it as superstition and stupid, or regard it as a fantasy and unattainable. But they actually don't know that cultivation is something that we do in our daily lives. If you read this supreme scripture and do as it says, then everyone can cultivate. Li Yundong was tongue-tied and asked, what kind of book is this? Zi Yuan kept him in suspense and said with a mysterious smile, you'll know when you get there. Li Yundong was curious and felt his heart itch. He couldn't wait to know what this classic book, which was regarded as the supreme book of the cultivation world, was. After waiting for a while, he suddenly heard the sound of a car honking downstairs. Zi Yuan smiled and said, let's go. Hongling is waiting for us downstairs. Li Yundong couldn't wait any longer. He rushed out of the door, went downstairs, and got into the car. As soon as he got in the car, he kept urging Zi Yuan, drive, drive. Where are we going? Zi Yuan smiled and said to Ruan Hongling, who was sitting in the driver's seat, let's go to the Xinhua bookstore on Renmin Road. Xinhua bookstore. I'm going to faint. Li Yundong almost fainted in the back seat. What's so strange about that? You don't know much. Ruan Hongling finally seized an opportunity to mock Li Yundong. Li Yundong was angry and couldn't help but pat the driver's seat in the front row. Hey, are you an adult? Do you have a driver's license? Do you think your parents don't care about you driving? Ruan Hongling was so angry that she stepped on the gas pedal. The Hongqi car roared and rushed out. Zi Yuan, who was sitting in the passenger seat, smiled and shook her head. Along the way, Li Yundong and Ruan Hongling kept sneering at each other. Sparks flew between the two of them, and smoke filled the air, which made Li Yundong feel a lot better. After a 20-minute drive, the three of them arrived at the entrance of the Xinhua bookstore. Ruan Hongling found a place to park the car. As soon as the car stopped, Li Yundong couldn't wait to get out and ran to the Xinhua bookstore. It was as if the supreme book would be bought by someone if he was a second late. Ruan Hongling couldn't help laughing again. Don't worry, it can't run away. This book can't grow legs. Li Yundong stopped and retorted bluntly, books don't have legs, but people do. Ruan Hongling sneered and said, who would compete with you? You really have the mentality of an ordinary citizen. Li Yundong also sneered and said, yes, I am an ordinary citizen. Why are you following me? Aren't you worse than an ordinary citizen? Ruan Hongling was so angry that she went crazy. Who wants to follow you? Go to hell. With that, she stomped her feet and was about to leave. Zi Yuan sighed secretly and said, stop arguing. Hurry up and go in. Li Yundong and Ruan Hongling looked at each other, snorted at the same time, and turned their heads to avoid looking at each other. After entering the bookstore, Zi Yuan walked in the front and led the way. Her ethereal temperament and beautiful appearance attracted the attention of everyone in the bookstore for a moment. Even Ruan Hongling was a beautiful girl who was no less beautiful than Su Chan. Seeing that everyone was looking at her, Ruan Hongling couldn't help but straighten her chest and raise her head. She gave Li Yundong a provocative look, as if to say, I am very charming. Why should I follow you? Li Yundong rolled his eyes. He was secretly worried about the supreme book, so he didn't want to argue with her. When Ruan Hongling saw that he was ignoring her, she became even angrier. She secretly gritted her teeth and thought to herself that she must find a way to teach him a lesson later. Li Yundong didn't have the mood to care about her little girl's thoughts. He saw Zi Yuan walking toward the medical section. She walked to a bookshelf, searched for a little, then took down a book and handed it to Li Yundong. Well, this is it. Li Yundong took the book and was stunned. He stammered, no way, just this one? Are you kidding me? Zi Yuan said softly. Why would I trick you? This is the supreme book recognized by the cultivation world for thousands of years. It is a cultivation classic that any cultivator must read. Ruan Hongling also interrupted. If you study economics without reading The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, the father of economics, how can you study economics? If you study military affairs without reading Sun Tzu's The Art of War, how can you study military affairs? If you study astronomy without reading Gonda's Gon Shixing Jing during the Warring States period, how can you study astronomy? In the same way, if you don't read the book in your hand, how can you cultivate the Tao? Although Li Yundong didn't like Ruan Hongling very much, he had to admit that what this bitch said made sense. He looked at the book in his hand and muttered to himself, is this really the supreme book of the cultivation world that they mentioned? Li Yundong was holding a thick book in his hand. This book was packaged in a hard cover, with a brown cover. On the cover were 4 ancient golden characters. Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor. /OM/. Chapter 163. Go to Watch Network. Zi Yuan saw him looking at the book in his hand with a face full of doubts. She smiled and said, The Yellow Emperor's Canon of Internal Medicine is the first medical work in China. It details the theory of yin and yang and the 5 elements, the theory of pulse, the theory of meridians, the theory of health, and the theory of qi. Go to the network. You can find the answers to the questions I asked you just now in this book. The expression on Li Yundong's face was still strange. He felt like someone had told him that there were immortals in this world, and then he pointed at them. He was shocked to find that the old women wearing red armbands on the side of the road were actually the immortals that this person had mentioned. This was too exaggerated. Li Yundong couldn't help asking, didn't you also say that this is a medical book? How can it be the supreme book of cultivation? Ruan Hongling, who was standing to one side, finally seized another opportunity and said with all her might, Idiot, idiot, haven't you heard of the saying that the Tao is manifested through medicine, and medicine carries the Tao? Li Yundong glanced at her and said, I haven't heard of it, but I've heard of the saying that only women and villains are difficult to raise. Ruan Hongling was so angry that she shouted. She pulled Zi Yuan's arm, pointed at Li Yundong, and said angrily, "Sister Zi Yuan, we helped him out of kindness, but he still said such words." Zi Yuan looked at her helplessly and said, "Can't you two stop for a while?" Then, Zi Yuan explained in detail to Li Yundong. "You must find it incredible. Why is such a medical book regarded as the supreme book of Taoism in the cultivation world?" Li Yundong nodded. Zi Yuan said, "Do you know the origin of our cultivation school?" Li Yundong shook his head. Zi Yuan said, "As early as the spring and autumn period, Laozi created the Taoist theory with the Tao Te Ching. This school spread to the Eastern Han Dynasty and gradually formed a religion. Among them, Zhang Ling believed in Laozi's Taoist theory and then created Taoism. This is the origin of the Taoist cultivation sects in the world." Li Yundong suddenly understood. "Ah, I see. It's the 5 pecks of rice sect." Zi Yuan said, "Yes, but do you know how Zhang Ling founded Taoism in the beginning and how he made so many people believe in him and worship him?" Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. "Practicing medicine?" Zi Yuan nodded slightly. "That's right. This was the Tao manifested through medicine, and medicine carried the Tao. Although there are thousands upon thousands of cultivation methods, and any one of them can allow one to become an immortal or a god when cultivated to the extreme, there are only 2 methods that allow one to become an immortal or a god in the shortest time. One is the Tao of medicine and the other is..." Without waiting for her to finish, Li Yundong quickly continued. "The other is martial arts." Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong with admiration. "That's right. Medicine carries the Tao. Martial arts protects the Tao. In order to make the world respect you, fear you, and not dare to offend you, it would be impossible for you to not be strong in martial arts. Watch net. 7K. Oath M. But if you want the world to love you, believe in you, and worship you, you can't just rely on force. Only by practicing medicine and doing good deeds can you do it." "Ah!" he exclaimed. All of a sudden, he felt as if all of the things that Su Chan had told him in the past had suddenly made sense to him. No wonder the little girl said that Sun Simiao is a god. It turned out that he really became a doctor. Has Sun Lutong also become an immortal? Zi Yuan said, "That's right. Sun Lutong, the tiger-head Xiaobai, has reached the peak of martial arts cultivation. Naturally, he entered the Tao and turned to cultivation to become an immortal." Li Yundong slapped his forehead. No wonder the 5 bucketfuls of rice sect was established to help people see doctors for free. It turns out that this is the reason. I thought they were trying to buy people's hearts and usurp power. As he said this, Li Yundong asked in confusion, "Since they are practicing medicine and doing good deeds, why don't they do it to the end? Why do they have to pay 5 bucketfuls of rice to join the sect?" Zi Yuan said, "For cultivators, the law is the first, and wealth is the second. If you don't have money, then don't even think about cultivation. This principle is the same as the poor studying and the rich practicing martial arts. The poor can't learn martial arts. Only the rich can practice martial arts because it consumes a lot of the human body's essence. Only the rich can make up for these losses with all kinds of food and medicinal herbs. And cultivation is even more like this. The money consumed is even 100 times more than practicing martial arts." Li Yundong thought of the poorest days when he and the little girl had been together. He nodded sadly and said, "That's true, but since the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor is sold everywhere, why don't I see people coming to cultivate it?" Zi Yuan sighed softly and said, "As the old saying goes, the human body is rare, and the true law is hard to hear. When the Yellow Emperor asked his teacher for advice, his teacher must have asked him to fast and take a bath. He must be respectful before he could teach him the great way. But that was ancient times, when there was a lack of information and resources. But we were born in modern times, with a huge amount of information and explosive knowledge resources. You can't see the true law and the real great way." Zi Yuan stared at Li Yundong and asked, "The real knowledge of the great way is by your side. For example, why do you say to close your eyes to rest instead of open your eyes to rest? Why do you say to buy things instead of buying the north and the south? Why do the Chinese characters in China say essence qi, essence blood, sperm, and essence yuan instead of qi essence, blood essence, seed essence, and yuan essence?" This series of questions stumped Li Yundong again. He smiled bitterly and said, "Now that you mention it, I suddenly feel like I'm illiterate. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "These are all knowledge of the Great Way. The so-called Great Way is under your feet. You step on it, but you don't notice its existence. As the successor of Jindan, you are like this, not to mention those mortals who are usually busy with urban life. We cultivators must ask why when we see something, because only by figuring out the reason can we cultivate without hindrance. After reading this book, will I be able to understand the problems you mentioned?" Li Yundong asked. Zi Yuan nodded and said, "Not only that, but you will also understand the mystery of the human body, the laws and truth between heaven and earth, and then you will understand what cultivation is all about." A thoughtful look appeared on Li Yundong's face. He pressed the inner cannon of the Yellow Emperor with both hands. For the first time, he felt that this book was so heavy. "Go to the internet." After a while, Li Yundong nodded and said, "I understand. Then I'll go back and read first." He turned around and was about to leave, but suddenly stood still, with an embarrassed look on his face. After a while, he turned around and said awkwardly, "I don't have any money with me." Ruan Hongling, who had been silent all this time, burst into laughter and rolled her eyes at Li Yundong. "If you don't have money, what can you do?" "Hongling!" Zi Yuan shouted in a low voice, and then said softly to Li Yundong, "Just read the book in peace. Don't worry about anything else. I will help you solve it." Li Yundong looked at Zi Yuan with a complicated look in his eyes. He was silent for a while and suddenly asked, "Why are you helping me?" Zi Yuan also looked at Li Yundong and said, "Because I want to find an answer from you." Li Yundong asked, "What answer?" Zi Yuan smiled and shook her head. "You won't understand even if I tell you. Don't ask. Anyway, I won't hurt you." Li Yundong thought for a moment. He thought that he was a bachelor now, and there was nothing to be cheated about. He nodded and said, "Then I'll thank you in advance. I'll remember your kindness. I'll return it to you later." Zi Yuan didn't stand on ceremony with him. She just nodded and said to Ruan Hongling, "Hongling, go and pay the bill." Ruan Hongling muttered unhappily, "Humph, I helped him out of kindness, but I still have to be scolded and pay the bill for him. How can there be such a reason in the world?" She walked up to Li Yundong and reached out her hand, shouting, "Hey, give me the book." Li Yundong was stunned for a moment and said warily, "What are you going to do?" Ruan Hongling said somewhat frantically, "Pay the bill." "You're holding the book. Are you going to pay the bill?" Li Yundong said, "Oh," and handed the book to her. Ruan Hongling walked to the cashier and paid the bill for Li Yundong. Then, she threw the book back to him and muttered, "Take your treasure." "Really, who cares about it? I can recite it backwards when I was 7 years old." Ignoring her, Li Yundong opened the book and began to read it carefully. When he got home, Li Yundong sat cross-legged in the living room, still in the habit of meditating in the past, facing east. Then, he began to read the supreme book of the cultivation world eagerly. Li Yundong couldn't remember when he had held a thick book so seriously. He only felt that he had never been so eager to obtain the knowledge of cultivation as he was now. He was like a hungry traveler, pursuing the source of truth on the long road of cultivation. Li Yundong unknowingly saw the evening of the next day. The sky was already dark. Taking advantage of the darkness, Ruan Hongling jumped from her balcony to Li Yundong's. Then, she waved her hand in front of Li Yundong and said, "Hey, are you still alive?" Only then did Li Yundong wake up. He saw Ruan Hongling standing in front of him, holding a plastic bag in her hand. He was stunned. "What are you doing here?" Ruan Hongling snorted. "I'm here to collect your body." Li Yundong snorted coldly. "I'm not dead yet. Thank you. The door is over there. Please close it gently when you go out." "Thank you." Ruan Hongling said angrily, "If Sister Zi Yuan hadn't asked me to come and see you, do you think I would be willing to come and see your dead face?" As she said this, she threw the plastic bag in her hand heavily on the table. Li Yundong raised his eyebrows. Just as he was about to speak, he saw Zi Yuan also flying over from the balcony. Li Yundong couldn't help but smile bitterly in his heart. Why don't these two women have the habit of going through the front door? Zi Yuan said in a low voice, "Hongling, cultivators should pay attention to self-cultivation. How can you cultivate with such a bad temper?" Ruan Hongling snorted angrily. She pointed at Li Yundong and said, If he hadn't angered me, would I have been so angry? Li Yundong didn't even look at her. He snorted coldly and said, "You asked for it." Ruan Hongling was so angry that she stamped her feet. "Sister Zi Yuan, look, look." Zi Yuan smiled bitterly and said, "You two should stop talking." As she said this, she looked at Li Yundong and said, "You've been obsessed with reading for a day and a night. Do you understand anything?" Li Yundong's eyes suddenly lit up. He nodded excitedly and said, "I understand a lot of things. For example, the things you mentioned before." Zi Yuan smiled and said, "Oh? Why don't you explain it to me?" Li Yundong explained, according to the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine, all the 5 senses belong to one place. Among them, the eyes belong to the liver. Once the eyes are closed, it is equivalent to closing the valve of the liver in the body. The blood flow of the human body will slow down, and the consumption of essence will also slow down. In other words, the metabolism will slow down, so the excess strength and energy will be stored. This is the meaning of closing your eyes to rest. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "Well, go on." Li Yundong continued, "As for buying things, this comes from the corresponding 5 elements of gold, wood, water, fire, and earth in the east, west, south, and north. Among them, things correspond to wood and gold. In ancient times, wood and metal could be made into things and used as commodities for exchange. The north and south correspond to water and fire. Water and fire can't be traded, but gold and wood can. Therefore, buying things does not mean buying north and south." Zi Yuan nodded appreciatively and said, "Well said. Is there anything else?" The more Li Yundong spoke, the brighter his eyes became. He felt that a strange but very familiar door of cultivation was slowly opening to him. The world inside was not something he knew nothing about. On the contrary, it was something he was familiar with, but he had to understand these things from another level. He said, "As for why I say essence, blood essence, sperm, and essence yuan, instead of qi essence, blood essence, child essence, and yuan essence. That's because according to the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine, essence is the most important thing in the human body. Only with essence can there be qi, only with essence can there be blood, only with essence can there be children, and only with essence can there be yuan. Therefore essence is the first and it can't be placed behind." Zi Yuan immediately asked, "Then do you know the difference between essence, blood essence, sperm, and essence yuan?" Li Yundong immediately said without hesitation, "Essence refers to the relationship between the kidneys and the meridians. If the kidneys can't contain essence, then the qi in the meridians will weaken. Once this qi is weak, people will have no strength, so there will be a saying that people have insufficient energy and essence." Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling looked at each other, secretly admiring the comprehension and clarity of the young man in front of them. Zi Yuan nodded and said, "Very good, continue." Li Yundong was encouraged, and he became more and more clear in his mind. The things he had been familiar with in the past were suddenly linked to the seemingly illusory things, and he became more and more excited. Li Yundong said, "As for blood essence, it refers to the relationship between the liver and the kidney. The kidney stores essence, and the liver stores blood. Although among the 5 internal organs, the liver ranks higher than the kidney, if people want to produce essence, the liver will produce a large amount of fresh blood, which will then be transformed into essence. Therefore, there is a saying that 1 drop of essence is equivalent to 10 drops of blood. This shows that essence is higher than blood." Zi Yuan nodded with a smile. Li Yundong added, "And sperm refers to the causal logic of reproduction. First there is essence and then there can be children. The causal logic can't be reversed, so this word can't be reversed either." Zi Yuan smiled and said, "What about essence qi? That's not easy to explain." Li Yundong thought for a moment and said, "This is actually very easy to explain, because essence qi refers to the causal logic of cultivation. People must have essence first, so there will be qi, blood, and spirit. If the human body's sperm is constantly consumed, then this person must consume a large amount of qi and blood to produce sperm, which will cause the internal damage and weakness of the human body. This is why it is said that people are emptied by women. According to the theory of cultivation, if a person constantly consumes sperm, then the qi and blood will also be consumed. The 3 essences of the human body, essence, qi, and blood, will naturally be greatly damaged. With this loss, it will be impossible to achieve the 3 essence gathering, let alone refine the three essences into divinity. And divinity is the Xueqi that cultivators have to refine into. Therefore, without essence, there will be no qi, no essence, no blood, and no spirit. It can be seen that there is a causal logic between essence and divinity. The order of the two can't be reversed. When Xueqi heard this, she couldn't help but praise. Wonderful, wonderful. I didn't expect you to understand so many truths in just one day. Ruan Hongling also looked at Li Yundong with her eyes wide open and thought to herself, this person is really talented. No wonder his cultivation progress is so fast. In just one day, he can understand so many truths. Amazing, really amazing. /om/ Chapter 164. Go to Watch Network. Hearing Xueqi's praise, Li Yundong smiled and said, in fact, these principles are very simple. It's like there's only a layer of window paper between us. You can understand it with a gentle poke. Once you understand it, it's not a big deal. Go to Watch Net. Xueqi smiled slightly, looked at the plastic bag on the coffee table in the living room, and said, this is the food I bought for you. You haven't eaten for a day. Eat it first. Li Yundong only felt excited. He didn't feel tired or hungry at all. He said, I want to watch it for a while. I'm not hungry at all. Ruan Hongling couldn't help but say angrily, hey, I worked hard to buy you food, but you don't want it. Xueqi shook her head slightly and said softly, it seems that you still don't understand the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, nor do you understand what cultivation is. Li Yundong glanced at Ruan Hongling and didn't answer her. Instead, he looked at Xueqi and asked in confusion, what do you mean? Xueqi said, what is cultivation? In other words, what is cultivation? Do you think you have to meditate and practice qi? That's cultivation? Li Yundong was stunned. Isn't it? Isn't cultivation the process of turning essence, qi, and blood into God through the process of 3 flowers in one's acupoint and 5 qis collecting in one's head? Xueqi shook her head and said, this is just the most one-sided understanding of cultivation. As she spoke, Xueqi opened the plastic bag, put the lunch boxes out one by one, and put them on the coffee table. She said, in a broad sense, cultivation is actually a kind of kung fu that conforms to the laws of heaven and nature. Then, by conforming to the laws of heaven and nature, one can find a way to fight against the laws of heaven and nature. Xueqi opened one of the lunch boxes, revealing a box of fried lotus root slices. She said, what is the law of heaven? What is the law of nature? The law of heaven is to work and rest according to the normal rules of the sun, moon, and stars. When it's time to sleep, you must sleep, and when it's time to cultivate, you must cultivate. What is the law of nature? The law of nature is that when you are full, don't be greedy, and when you are hungry, you must eat. Xueqi put the lunch boxes in the plastic bag and then put the chopsticks in place, like a virtuous wife. As she put them, she said, you said before that if a person consumes too much sperm, it will cause a great loss of qi and blood in the body, and the whole person will be very weak. Go to Watch Net. Net. Super_speed. More. Since you understand this, why don't you understand that if a person doesn't eat after mealtime, it will also cause the body's qi and blood to be deficient? Li Yundong finally understood. He sat down on the sofa obediently, lowered his head, and began to eat without making a sound. Watching him wolfing down his food, Xueqi couldn't help but shake her head and say, you have to eat slowly. Since ancient times, which cultivator ate like you? If you don't chew your food carefully and swallow it slowly, then the food you eat is not fine enough. Your stomach needs to consume a lot of energy and blood qi to grind the food. The strength of the human body is limited. If you spend more energy on digesting food, then you will have less energy to cultivate. Although Li Yundong had some understanding of the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor, he was still not as good as a senior cultivator like Xueqi, who had been cultivating since she was in her mother's womb. When he heard Xueqi's words, which were easy to understand, he suddenly had a lot of insights in his heart. Ah, I understand. No wonder some people are prone to stomach problems when they are old. It must be because they consumed too much qi and blood in the digestion of food when they were young. Xueqi smiled and said, there is a reason. Li Yundong was in a daze for a long time, and his eyes became brighter and brighter. It was obvious that he had integrated a lot of things and knowledge in his heart. Seeing that he was lost in thought, Zi Yuan couldn't help but gently knock on the table and say softly, "Eat first." Li Yundong came to his senses and smiled embarrassedly. Then he took a mouthful of rice and chewed slowly. This time, he chewed very carefully. Zi Yuan knelt opposite Li Yundong and watched him eat intently. Ruan Hongling looked bored, so she sat on a chair in the dining room and looked around. After Li Yundong finished eating, he suddenly remembered something. He stood up and said, "Can you take me to a hotel? I need to get something." Zi Yuan asked, "What is it?" Li Yundong said, "It's a room that Su Chan and I rented to hide from you. There are things in the room. Go to the internet." 7K. Oath M. Rainbow carrot asterisk literature under learning % super hashtag fast. Update. Zi Yuan nodded and said, "You can go out for a walk after dinner and exercise your qi and blood." Li Yundong nodded. Before he went out, he suddenly remembered something and handed Ruan Hongling's magical item to Zi Yuan. "I'll return this to you." Zi Yuan smiled in surprise. "Why are you willing to return it?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "No matter what, you have helped me so much now. How can I still take this?" As he said this, Li Yundong said to Ruan Hongling, "I'll return it to you. Don't be so rude in the future." Ruan Hongling stared at her magical item, her eyes full of surprise. She giggled and said, "That depends on your performance." They went out. When they went downstairs, Li Yundong found that there were many people gathered in the pavilion of the community. Some people were pointing at the stone table and talking about it. Obviously, they were curious about how the palm print on the table had come about. Strange, why is there a palm print on the table after only one day? Who did this? I haven't seen anyone knock on it for a day. Li Yundong glanced at them and smiled in his heart. Then, he got into the Hongqi car. Ruan Hongling was still driving. The group of people arrived at the hotel where they had stayed before. Li Yundong got out of the car and went into the room to get his things. Holding the little girl's piggy bank in his arms, he felt a little sad. He stood in the room for a while with a gloomy look on his face. Then, he returned the room card and returned to his home in Hongxing New District. When he got home, Zi Yuan, who had followed him into the room, saw the big black iron fan that Li Yundong had placed at the door. She couldn't help but shake her head and say, "The most precious magical weapon of the Fox Zen School has been thrown away by you so casually. I really don't know what the fox with the rock face would think if he were still here." Only then did Li Yundong remember that Su Chan had given him this powerful magical weapon. He walked to the door, picked up the heavy iron fan, and said in confusion, "This thing is so heavy. How can it be a powerful magical weapon?" Ruan Hongling, who was sitting on the sofa, sneered and said, "It's just that you don't know how to use it. There are no heavy magical weapons in this world." Li Yundong looked at the big iron fan in his hand. Other than feeling that the big iron fan was exceptionally heavy and that the leaves of the big iron fan were full of golden Sanskrit characters, there was nothing special about it. Zi Yuan pointed to the big iron fan and said, "Open the iron fan and have a look." Li Yundong moved his wrist and wanted to open the iron fan, but he was surprised to find that the fan seemed to be rusty and didn't move at all. Li Yundong was stunned. He exerted a little qi and increased the strength in his hand. Only then did the iron fan slowly open. Every time he opened a fan, there would be a clanging sound of friction between the leaves, which was sonorous and powerful. When all the fans were opened, a fan-shaped iron wall appeared in front of Li Yundong's eyes. The wall was full of golden Sanskrit characters, shining with golden light. It seemed that every word was about to come out. Li Yundong stroked the fan with his hand. Although he couldn't understand the meaning of the exquisite Sanskrit characters on the fan leaves, he liked the beauty of these characters very much. The iron fan was cold and delicate to the touch, revealing a deep majesty, which made Li Yundong fondle it fondly. He looked at the powerful magical weapon that Su Chan had left for him before she left, as if he had seen the lively voice and smile of the little girl appear in front of him. For a moment, he was lost in thought and was a little obsessed. Zi Yuan said, "Do you still remember what I said?" Li Yundong woke up with a start. "What did you say?" Looking at the majestic iron fan, Zi Yuan's eyes were full of admiration. She said, "You have to ask why everything happens. Don't you want to know the name of this iron fan?" Li Yundong thought for a moment and shook his head. Su Chan didn't tell me. Zi Yuan said, this iron fan is called the Seven Treasure Psychic Fan. Do you know why it's called the Seven Treasure Psychic Fan? Li Yundong asked why. Zi Yuan said, this fan was made by Pan Shi Fox before he became an immortal. In order to remember the kindness of Zen Master Bai Zhang, he engraved the Vajra Sutra on the treasure fan and added the power of the Supreme Vajra Buddha. Only men with the seven treasures body can use it. Li Yundong asked in confusion. What do you mean that only men with the seven treasures body can't use it? Seeing that he had taken the initiative to ask, Zi Yuan nodded with appreciation. By the way, you can't just know how it is, but not why it is. You have to ask everything clearly. Otherwise, your cultivation will become demonic. Ruan Hongling, who was bored to the side, couldn't help but interrupt. Hey, idiot, let me explain it to you. The so-called only men with the seven treasures body can't use it means that Sakyamuni, the old man who valued men more than women, said in the 27th section of the Seven Treasures Theory of Men in the General Theory of the Vajra Heart, that men have 7 treasures, while women have 5. Zi Yuan couldn't help but glare at Ruan Hongling. Hongling, don't be rude to Buddha. Ruan Hongling said loudly, unconvinced, that's right. Look at the disciples of Gautama Buddha. Which one of them is a woman? Look at the sky full of Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Vajra Arhats. Which one of them is a woman? Isn't Guanyin Bodhisattva a woman? Ruan Hongling burst out laughing and clapped her hands. Are you kidding me? It is said in the Avatamsaka Sutra, a brave and fierce man looks at himself. He, Manjushri Bodhisattva, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, and Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva are known as the 4 great bodhisattvas. How could such a mighty man be a woman? Li Yundong looked embarrassed. Although he had read a lot of miscellaneous books, he really didn't know that Guanyin Bodhisattva was actually a man. Is this the legendary ancestor of human demons? Li Yundong suddenly had a very dirty and disrespectful thought in his heart. Shemale is so awesome that everyone in the world worships him. This is probably the highest realm of Shemale, right? No wonder Thailand is a Buddhist and has many transvestites. It turns out that they have a tradition. Then what does this fan have to do with Sakyamuni's preference for men over women? Li Yundong thought for a while, then asked, what does this fan have to do with Sakyamuni's preference for boys? /om/. Chapter 165. Go to watch net. Ruan Hongling snorted with a look of indignation on her face. It's all because Buddha favors men over women, so all the cultivation methods passed down are extremely fierce and masculine. The mystical silver fox, the 4th-generation leader of the Fox Zen school, sneaked into Mount Wutai to secretly learn the secret methods of Buddhism. She did learn the great Vajra technique, but unfortunately, she was a woman. Practicing this cultivation method, she almost died of chi deviation. If Master Xueqi hadn't sacrificed himself to save her, how could she have become so famous? When Li Yundong heard this, he couldn't help thinking, it makes sense. Which of the 72 ultimate skills of the Shaolin Temple is not the peak skill of the external sex? I just don't know what kind of magic this great Vajra technique is. How could a woman suffer chi deviation when practicing it? Go to watch net. 7K. Oath M. Ruan Hongling continued, because this treasure fan can only be used by men, and men have the body of 7 treasures, it is called the 7 treasures fan. Moreover, because it is engraved with the Vajra Sutra and blessed with the power of the Supreme Vajra Buddha, it has a strong protective power and can sense the mind of the master. Therefore, its full name is the 7 treasures fan. Li Yunyong closed the fan of 7 treasures and tried it in his hand. Although his strength had increased greatly, he still felt that it was a little difficult for him to bear the weight of more than 50 kilograms in his hand. Moreover, Guan Yu's green dragon crescent blade was only 82 kilograms. Li Yundong waved the fan and heard the low sound of the wind in the air. It was very powerful. After waving it 3 or 4 times, he felt that his arm was a little swollen. He quickly put it down and sighed slightly. No wonder Su Chan said that even the people of the Fox Zen school can't use this magical item. Ruan Hongling snorted coldly and said, the Fox Zen school has produced a few geniuses, especially the mystical silver fox. Her spiritual power is unparalleled in the world, but now she has declined greatly. It's not easy for Ao Wushuang to appear, but unfortunately, at this time, Zi Yuan suddenly interrupted Yuan Hongling. Hongling, don't talk about other sections. Yuan Hongling made a face at Zi Yuan and continued to say to Li Yundong, don't think that you're amazing just because you beat me up a few times. In the world of cultivation, men had 7 treasures, while women had 5. It was easy for men to cultivate, but difficult for women. This was a publicly acknowledged fact, so even if you beat me, it would be an unfair victory. Go and flip through the history books. How many mortals have become immortal since ancient times? How many men and how many women? Li Yundong couldn't help but think to himself, isn't that right? Wasn't the 8 immortals in the most popular story, the 8 immortals crossing the sea, one of them? Iron Crutchley, male. Han Zhongli, a man. Zhang Guilao, male. Lu Dongbin, a man. Han Xiangzi, Imperial Uncle Chao, a man. Lan Saihe, this name sounds like a woman, but it's still a man. Only Immortal Lady he was a woman. Li Yundong thought of something and asked, what is the body of 7 treasures? What does that mean? When Yuan Hongling saw that he didn't know anything, she became a little impatient and shouted, oh, why don't you know anything? You're so annoying. Sister Zi Yuan, you tell him. Go to the internet. 7K. Oath M. At this time, Li Yundong was eager for anything related to cultivation. He didn't care about Yuan Hongling's attitude, so he turned his eyes to Zi Yuan. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and explained in a soft voice. It is said in the general theory of the Vajra heart, once a man has a treasure of ambition, he will wander around fearlessly. Secondly, a treasure with a master, he will be good at balancing. Thirdly, a treasure with a family, he will be good at making money and establishing a career. Fourthly, a treasure with a peaceful life, he will be good at helping the monarch raise his family. Fifthly, a treasure with a sage's wisdom, he will be good at deciding right and wrong. Sixthly, a treasure with a peaceful country, he will be good at making decisions. Seventhly, a treasure with a stable nature, he will be good at making friends with sages. It is a man's body of 7 treasures. Li Yundong nodded. He subconsciously wanted to ask, what does it mean for a woman to have the body of 5 treasures? Since it's hard for women to cultivate, how did you guys manage to cultivate so many magic arts? How could Ao Wushuang be so powerful? However, Li Yundong thought for a moment and felt that such a question might offend Zi Yuan, so he held back and kept it in mind. He thought to himself, when I finish the Zhuji phase, I will slowly study these basic theoretical knowledge. Li Yundong asked, how do I use this iron fan? Zi Yuan said, this iron fan has 2 uses. One is that it can be used as an ordinary weapon, and the other is that it can be used as a magic item. Li Yundong couldn't help but smile bitterly. This thing is big and heavy. How can it be used as a weapon? To hit people with it? Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong, stretched out her hand, and said with a smile, would you like to let me use it? Li Yundong thought that if this woman wanted to snatch it, he wouldn't be able to beat her, so he might as well be generous. Thinking of this, Li Yundong handed over the fan of 7 treasures. Go to the internet. 7K. Oath M. Although Zi Yuan looked thin, like a weak willow in the wind, her slender hand easily held the big iron fan, which weighed more than 50 kilograms. Zi Yuan held the fan of 7 treasures in one hand, and then reached out to Li Yundong with the other, saying, it's too narrow here. Let's go somewhere else and I'll show you. Li Yundong knew that Zi Yuan wanted to hold his hand and fly, so he sighed in his heart, when can I fly freely in the sky? Zi Yuan seemed to have seen through Li Yundong's thoughts, so she said with a smile, don't worry, you can fly by yourself in the future. After that, Zi Yuan silently added in her heart, after you get through the divine tribulation. But how can you get through it? If you can't get through the divine tribulation, how can the words left behind by Master come true? Zi Yuan shook her head slightly, as if she wanted to drive this idea out of her mind. She gently put her hand on Li Yundong's wrist. Li Yundong only felt a sudden warmth in his body, and then he flew up. In the blink of an eye, he flew out of the balcony and landed on the roof. This building was the tallest in Hongxing New area, and there were no buildings that were taller than it. When Li Yundong and the others came to the center of the roof, no one would see them at all. Zi Yuan held the fan of 7 treasures and motioned for Li Yundong to stand a little further away. Then she said, "Look carefully." As she spoke, she held the fan with one hand and shook her wrist. With a swoosh, all the blades of the fan opened. Each blade was like a blade, spinning like a wheel. Li Yundong saw that the fan was flying up and down in Zi Yuan's hand, especially the fan blades. They opened and closed with a swoosh. The top of each fan blade was like a blade. As long as one touched it, not only would one's tendons and bones be broken, but the whole person might even be cut into several pieces. Zi Yuan's steps were quick and ethereal, and her figure was as light as a fairy in the clouds. She moved faster and faster. The big iron fan in her hand moved up and down, and the fan blades opened and closed. The sound was really like thousands of swords being sheathed at the same time. The sound was loud and murderous. The golden Sanskrit characters on the fan blades were floating and flashing, as if they were about to fly out. Zi Yuan waved the fan proudly. The sound of the treasured fan opening and closing was endless, like a continuous string of silk. The dark light of the iron fan almost enveloped Zi Yuan's graceful figure, and the golden characters engraved on the leaves of the iron fan were like a layer of glittering golden cassia, floating in the air like a pagoda. Li Yundong was fascinated by the scene. Even the dazzling computer stunts in Hollywood blockbusters were not as exaggerated as Zi Yuan's fan dancing in front of him. Li Yundong couldn't help but be shocked and excited. It turned out that this seemingly clumsy and heavy iron fan could be used like this. When could he be like Zi Yuan and use the fan of 7 treasures so awesome? As Li Yunyang was engrossed in watching, Zi Yuan suddenly let out a loud shout. Her dancing figure suddenly stopped, and the fan abruptly folded. The dark light that shrouded the surroundings suddenly disappeared, and the golden cassia also disappeared. She stood still with a snap, and the iron fan that was as tall as a person was put behind her. She stood like a pine tree, looking indescribably valiant and heroic. Although Li Yundong had always been on guard and hostile towards Zi Yuan in his heart, at this moment, he was completely shocked by Zi Yuan's fan dance and secretly admired her in his heart. Good. Li Yundong couldn't help cheering loudly. He praised, "It's really like thunder, and it's like the clear light of the river and sea. Amazing, amazing." Although Zi Yuan had been dancing the most powerful part of the fan just now, her whole figure could hardly be seen, and only the scripture pagoda could be seen. However, after she put away the fan, her expression did not change. She smiled calmly and said, "You flatter me." Ruan Hongling looked at Zi Yuan with admiration and said proudly, "My sister Zi Yuan's ability is more than that." Li Yundong nodded in agreement. He asked, "Is this the ordinary way to use the fan of 7 treasures?" Zi Yuan said, "Yes, if you can use this big iron fan skillfully, with your cultivation, even if you encounter some gangsters who want to harm you, as long as their cultivation is not higher than yours by a few realms, you will be able to deal with them." Li Yundong asked curiously, "Then how do I use this fan of 7 treasures as a magical item?" Zi Yuan laughed. She spread out her palm, and the heavy fan of 7 treasures slowly flew toward Li Yundong. She said, "I don't have the body of 7 treasures, so I can't use this fan of 7 treasures. Only men with pure yang qi can use this artifact, so I can't show it to you. Only after you reach the Xueqi phase can you activate the magical item of the fan of 7 treasures." Li Yundong took the heavy fan of 7 treasures and no longer dared to underestimate it because of its heavy weight. He thought of Zi Yuan's fan dance before and couldn't help thinking, "Now this fan of 7 treasures looks very powerful. If I can use the power of its magical item, what will it be like?" Li Yundong couldn't help but feel excited. He wished he could immediately practice according to the method that Zi Yuan had used before. Zi Yuan knew that Li Yundong must be eager to try now, so she didn't disturb him. She waved to Ruan Hongling, and then the two of them flew back to their home. Ruan Hongling couldn't help asking, "Sister Zi Yuan, how long are you going to help him? Although this guy looks very smart and has Jindan's Yuanqi, he has only cultivated for less than 2 months after all. His foundation is too weak. Even if he succeeds in the Xueqi phase, how will he deal with the heavenly tribulation?" Zi Yuan was silent. After a long while she said, "I don't know. I'm just doing my best. If he can't get through the heavenly tribulation, it means that Master Psalm is wrong. If he gets through the heavenly tribulation, then what?" Ruan Hongling asked. Zi Yuan sighed and looked at the starry sky in the dark night. "I don't know." Ruan Hongling snorted. "This hateful guy. We helped him so much, but I still have to endure his anger. I'm so angry. Zi Yuan smiled and said, don't worry. In a few days at most, he will be able to go to the Xueqi phase. You won't be able to see him then. Ruan Hongling was surprised. So soon? Zi Yuan nodded. I will take him to a place, the most dangerous place in the world, but also the best place for the Xueqi phase. Ruan Hongling's eyes suddenly widened. Sister Zi Yuan, are you crazy? How can he go to that place? I'm afraid that he will die before he can reach the Xueqi phase. Zi Yuan said lightly, that depends on his cultivation. If he can't even get through this, how can he face the terrifying heavenly tribulation after the Xueqi phase? /OM/ Chapter 166. Go to Watch Network. Early the next morning, Ruan Hongling still jumped from the balcony to the balcony of Li Yundong's house. She stretched her head to take a look, only to find that there was no one in the room. She called out, but there was no response. Ruan Hongling muttered to herself, this bastard hasn't practiced all night, has he? Just as he was hesitating, Ruan Hongling focused her attention and listened carefully. Sure enough, she heard a slight sound of something tearing through the air. Ruan Hongling shook her head and snorted coldly. What a hopeless idiot. I already told him that haste makes waste, but he just doesn't listen. Does he think he can train it in one night? What a fool's dream. As she spoke, she looked around on the balcony. After finding that no one was paying attention, she tapped her toes and flew up to the roof. As soon as she got on the roof, Ruan Hongling's eyes widened. She saw a black ball rolling on the balcony. Countless golden Sanskrit characters were floating outside the black ball. Although it was daytime, they were still shining with golden light, as if they were a layer of golden Buddha characters. The black ball kept making a whistling sound, and sand and stones were flying like a strong wind. There was also a dense clanging sound in the middle of the whistling sound, which was the sound of the iron fan opening and closing. If one closed their eyes and listened, it seemed that thousands of soldiers were pulling out their long swords from their scabbards one after another. The sound was sonorous and murderous. Ruan Hongling's eyes widened, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She stammered, This isn't him waving the fan, is it? While he was hesitating, the black ball suddenly disappeared. The golden characters around the black ball also floated and twisted for a while before slowly dissipating in the air. In the middle of it, a man with white steam rising from his body appeared. It was Li Yundong. Li Yunyong shook his wrist, and all the leaves of the fan of 7 treasures, which was as tall as a man, suddenly closed. The black light and golden pagoda of the black fan and the golden Sanskrit also disappeared. But with a loud shout, he threw the fan of 7 treasures above his head. With a swoosh, the iron fan opened again in an instant, whistling and spinning violently in the air like a razor that kept spinning. As soon as the fan left his hand, he instantly kicked 3 times in a row, and the bones in his body made a strong and powerful sound. As soon as he finished the 3 kicks, the fan of 7 treasures, which was rolling in the air, suddenly fell down. The sharp edges of the fan rotated at a high speed like a saw. As long as an object was cut by it, even if it was a steel bar, it would immediately be cut in half. Li Yundong saw it accurately. He stretched out his hand toward the flying and rolling fan and accurately pinched the bones of the fan. Then, he spun his feet and exerted force from his waist. The fan suddenly closed with a swish. Li Yundong turned around and retreated. He fiercely smashed the fan of 7 treasures in his hand over his head. The momentum was so powerful that Ruan Hongling felt that if he smashed the fan down, the building would be destroyed by him. However, as soon as the fan in Li Yundong's hand was waved in the air, it suddenly stopped, as if the monstrous flood had suddenly turned into a sea of ice and snow, motionless. Go to the internet. From being fierce to suddenly calm, Ruan Hongling could only stare blankly. Although she was a cultivator who was good at magic, she was not a layman in martial arts. As the saying goes, 10 daras, 9 doctors, 10 daras, 9 martial arts. This meant that 9 out of 10 cultivators knew how to treat diseases, and 9 out of 10 also knew how to fight for self-defense. Ruan Hongling knew that it was a little inexplicable that Li Yundong had thrown the fan up just now, but she suddenly saw that after Li Yundong had thrown the fan of 7 treasures up, he had suddenly kicked 3 times fiercely. She couldn't help but cheer in her heart. What a good diversion. But when Li Yundong took the fan, shook his wrist, and closed the iron fan in an instant. Wan Hongling's eyes suddenly lit up. She knew that if someone attacked at this time, Li Yundong could use the sharp edge of the iron fan to cut the opponent. But the best move was Li Yundong's move of turning around and retreating. Martial arts and the art of war were interlinked. When Sun Tzu, the sage of war, wrote in The Art of War, the most brilliant strategy was to escape. No matter how strong the move was, if the opponent dodged or ran away, it would be useless if he couldn't hit him. Li Yundong's turning around and retreating was the best strategy of the 36 stratagems. However, after he turned around, he used the force of the turn to smash the iron fan forward like an iron pillar. This move had the meaning of back thrust and knife-dragging technique. It could be said to be an exquisite killing move. After Li Yundong had completely calmed down, Wan Hongling couldn't help but ask loudly, "How did you become so powerful all of a sudden? Could it be that Sister Zi Yuan taught you a few moves last night?" Although Li Yundong had finished the fierce fan dance and the qi in his body was boiling, there was only white steam rising from the top of his head. There was no sweat on his body, and his face was only a little ruddy. He didn't look like a person who had just undergone intense exercise. Go to the internet. 7K. Oath M. Hearing Wan Hongling's voice, Li Yundong turned his head to look at her and shook his head. No. Wan Hongling's eyes widened. Then where did you learn that move just now? Li Yundong said, I figured it out myself. Wan Hongling cried out involuntarily. You figured it out yourself? No way. She looked at Li Yundong in shock and thought to herself, is he bragging? It's one thing for him to practice the fan of 7 treasures so skillfully in one night, but he can also immediately come up with a killing move from the use of this iron fan? Is this guy a freak? Even if he's a genius, he shouldn't be so exaggerated, right? Wan Hongling looked Li Yundong up and down as if she had seen a visitor from outer space. When Zi Yuan also went up to the roof, she came to her senses. She took Zi Yuan's arm, pointed at Li Yundong, and said, Sister Zi Yuan, just now he. For a moment, Wan Hongling couldn't find the right words to describe Li Yundong. Zi Yuan looked at Wan Hongling in confusion. What's wrong with you? Wan Hongling stared at Li Yundong and thought to herself, this guy's cultivation progress is so fast. It won't be long before he surpasses me. Thinking of this, Wan Hongling felt sour in her heart. She said with flagging interest, it's nothing. You can ask him. Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong in confusion again. Li Yundong had some respect for this female cultivator who looked like a fairy. He smiled slightly and said, it's nothing. I just practiced the fan of 7 treasures all night and finally made some progress. I have some experience. Wan Hongling rolled her eyes and thought to herself, you've practiced so skillfully. How can this be called a little progress and experience? However, Zi Yuan didn't take it seriously, as if she didn't believe it. There was a hint of blame in her tone as she said, why didn't you listen to what you said before? Didn't I tell you that cultivation should follow the way of heaven and the rules? You must sleep when it's time to sleep. Why don't you sleep at night? Li Yundong smiled bitterly and said, you two left so suddenly last night and left me alone on the roof. I can go up, but I can't go down. Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling were stunned at the same time. Then Wan Hongling raised her head and burst into laughter. Zi Yuan couldn't help but burst into laughter. She turned her head to the side and covered her mouth to snicker. Li Yundong said helplessly amid the laughter, I'm alone on this roof. If I don't practice the fan of 7 treasures, what else can I do? Zi Yuan laughed for a while. She pursed her lips slightly and said with a smile in her eyes, it's my fault. Now hurry up and go down with us. Have a good rest later. I have something to tell you. Li Yundong nodded, then held Zi Yuan's outstretched hand. After a while, he returned to his home. Zi Yuan said, this is the time when the yang qi is strong. You can sit facing the east and practice qi. Although it can't make up for the sleepiness caused by you not sleeping last night, it can at least keep you from feeling tired for a day. Li Yundong nodded and did as he was told. Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling looked at each other and left Li Yundong's house from the balcony. Li Yundong faced the rising sun and meditated to practice qi. He only felt that his whole body was warm, as if there was a hot current flowing in his body. Wherever it flowed, he felt comfortable and refreshed, and his fatigue immediately disappeared. He didn't know how long he had been doing this. When he was done, he opened his eyes and found that Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling were staring at him. Li Yundong was stunned. "What's wrong?" Wan Hongling's expression was a little strange and she didn't say a word. Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "It's nothing. The Jindan Yuan Qi and Tongzi Yuan Qi in your body are not easy to come by. You should cherish them." "Why does this sound so strange?" Li Yundong muttered in his heart. He didn't answer Zi Yuan's words, but his eyes swept over Wan Hongling's hand. He suddenly smiled embarrassedly and said, "You brought me food again? How can I trouble you all the time?" "Thank you." Wan Hongling snorted and said, "You also know how to say thank you?" After that, she put the plastic bag in her hand on the tea table. Although Li Yundong had been arguing with Wan Hongling for the past few days, Wan Hongling and Zi Yuan had been helping him no matter what. Li Yundong saw this and remembered it in his heart. Although he didn't say it out loud, he was secretly grateful in his heart. Especially towards Zi Yuan, he had a lot of respect in his heart, and even his attitude towards Wan Hongling had improved a lot. Although Li Yundong heard Wan Hongling talk about him, he didn't argue with her. He opened the plastic bag and took out the lunchbox inside. He was about to eat when he suddenly thought of something. He looked up and asked, "By the way, have you eaten?" Before Zi Yuan could speak, Wan Hongling snorted and said, "God has pity on you. You also know how to care about others? The two of us are still hungry." Zi Yuan looked at Wan Hongling reproachfully and said to Li Yundong apologetically, "Don't listen to her nonsense. We all ate this morning." Li Yundong laughed and said, "It's noon now. You told me that you ate in the morning. Aren't you scolding me?" As he said this, Li Yundong stood up and said, "Wait here for a while. I'll go out for a while." As he said this, he walked to the door. Just as he was about to go out, he suddenly turned around and said, "By the way, can you come through the door next time? Don't always fly around the balcony like a cat thief, okay?" As he said this, he went out without waiting for Zi Yuan and Wan Hongling to reply. Wan Hongling turned her head to look at Zi Yuan and said angrily, "Sister Zi Yuan, he called us a cat thief." Zi Yuan smiled slightly and didn't say anything. Seeing that she hadn't succeeded in fanning the flames, Wan Hongling rolled her eyes and said, "Sister Zi Yuan, what do you think he's doing?" Zi Yuan said with a smile, "You already know the answer in your heart. Why do you still ask me?" Wan Hongling giggled and was about to speak when she suddenly heard the sound of a cell phone ringing on the sofa. She turned her head and saw that Li Yundong's cell phone was vibrating on the sofa. Wan Hongling said curiously, "Hey, who's calling?" As she said this, she picked up the phone and glanced at it, only to see that the caller ID was clearly written, Chick/OM/. Chapter 167. Go to watch net. Seeing Wan Hongling pick up the phone, Zi Yuan couldn't help but shout in a low voice, "Hongling, don't touch his things." Wan Hongling snorted and said, "He also robbed my powerful magical weapon. What's wrong with touching his cell phone?" As she spoke, she pressed the answer button, and then a strange smile appeared on her face, as if she had just pulled a prank on Lin Sanjiu. Go to watch net. 7K. O-/ As soon as she pressed the answer button on the phone, a soft voice came and said coquettishly, "Sir, guess who I am?" Wan Hongling could tell at once that it was the voice of the little fox spirit. She sneered and didn't say anything. On the other end of the phone, Su-chan heard that there was no sound from Li Yundong's side, so she thought that he was too excited to speak. She giggled and said, "Can't you tell? It's me, little girl, your little girl." Along the way, Su-chan waited for her master, Ao Wushuang, to leave for a while. Then she immediately picked up her cell phone and secretly called Li Yundong. When she was on the phone, she was still worried that the call would not go through. But as soon as she dialed and said a few words, before she had time to be happy, she heard a woman's cold snort coming from the phone, and then the phone was hung up. This time, Su-chan's mind was like a clap of thunder, which scared her out of her wits. Yundong has a new lover. He doesn't want me? Thinking of this, Su-chan couldn't wait to fly back to Li Yundong's side to see what was going on. But as soon as she thought of this, she saw her master coming back. Su-chan had to quickly hide the phone. Su-chan hid her phone, but she couldn't hide her thoughts. Her mind was filled with the cold snort that came from the other side of the phone. She felt as if her soul had been shattered by that cold snort. Her whole body felt light, and she couldn't even stand steadily. Her mind was a complete mess. Yundong won't really abandon me, will he? No, he wouldn't. But, what if he really doesn't want me? Su Chan's mind was in a mess, and she couldn't help but cry. Seeing her like this, Ao Wushuang couldn't help sighing and saying, "You miss him again? Sigh, what a sin." Su Chan raised her head and looked at Ao Wushuang with tearful eyes. "Master, can I go back and have a look?" Ao Wushuang said with a cold face. "No, absolutely not. If you go back now, he definitely won't be able to concentrate on building his foundation." Su Chan was panicked and thought to herself, "No, Yundong won't abandon me. I'll make another call later and ask him about it." Watch net. When Ruan Hongling heard that it was Su Chan's call, she wanted to mock her, but just as she was about to open her mouth, Zi Yuan glared at her. Ruan Hongling curled her lips resentfully, snorted, and hung up the phone. Then, she threw the phone on the sofa and muttered, "I really don't know what's so good about this guy. Why do you protect him like this?" Zi Yuan didn't say anything. She just stood quietly in the room with her eyes slightly closed. She closed her eyes to rest. After a while, there was the sound of keys at the door of the room. Li Yundong pushed the door open and walked in, carrying 2 plastic bags in his hand. Ruan Hongling looked at him curiously and said, "Hey, did you go out to buy vegetables?" Li Yundong nodded and said, "Well, although there has been some friction between us, I don't have anything to repay you for helping me like this these days. It just so happens that you haven't eaten yet, so I'll cook a meal for you." Zi Yuan laughed and said, "How can I do that?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "I can't let you two starve and watch me eat alone, can I? Anyway, I've already bought them. You wait in the living room for a while. I'll be back soon." Ruan Hongling asked suspiciously, "You can cook?" Li Yundong glanced at her and surprisingly didn't bicker with her. He just said lightly, "You'll know whether I can or not in a while." As he said this, he carried the plastic bags into the kitchen. Ruan Hongling snorted and muttered in a low voice, "Didn't you say that you had no money? Why do you have money to buy vegetables?" Li Yundong's voice came from the kitchen. "I checked out of the hotel and refunded some money." Ruan Hongling had spoken in a very low voice before, so she hadn't expected that Li Yundong would hear her. She immediately stuck out her tongue. Zi Yuan shook her head at her and smiled helplessly. "Go to the internet." After a while, the sound of vegetables being washed and cut came from the kitchen. Zi Yuan felt a little uneasy, so she stood up and walked into the kitchen. She smiled and said, "Let me help. It's a little embarrassing to sit back and enjoy the fruits of others' labor." Li Yundong smiled and said, "No need. It's better for girls like you not to enter the kitchen." Speaking of this, Li Yundong couldn't help but think of the trouble Su Chan had caused in the kitchen. For a moment, his eyes suddenly became erratic, as if he was thinking about the little things he had done with Su Chan. The expression on his face also became gentle. Zi Yuan smiled and didn't say anything. She just gently rolled up her sleeves with her fingers. Ruan Hongling, who was at the door, said loudly, "Don't look down on Sister Zi Yuan. Her cooking skills are very good. She's definitely better than you." Li Yundong looked at Zi Yuan in surprise. "Oh, I couldn't tell." Zi Yuan smiled slightly and said, "Don't listen to her nonsense. I can only cook a few home-cooked dishes. When I lived alone in the past, I could only cook by myself. Otherwise, I could only eat raw rice. How could I not know a little cooking?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "Why don't you cook 2 of your best dishes, and I'll cook 2 of my best dishes?" Zi Yuan agreed with a smile. It's better to be polite than to be polite. Ruan Hongling clapped her hands and said with a smile, "Great, I can eat the food cooked by Sister Zi Yuan again." Zi Yuan glanced at her, her eyes full of the doting gaze of an elder looking at a naughty junior. Okay, don't make trouble here. Go wait for a while." Ruan Hongling giggled and pretended to run to the living room to wait, but after a while, she slipped back and hid at the door, peeking inside. In the kitchen, Li Yundong was wearing an apron. He looked at Zi Yuan curiously and said, "Don't you want to wear an apron?" Zi Yuan shook her head with a smile. She stretched out her slender hand, picked up a white radish from the plastic bag, and gently washed it with water in the pool. Li Yunyang saw that even though the woman was washing vegetables, she still exuded a kind of otherworldly elegance. Her soft hands, which seemed to be spotless, gently swept over the radish, and the radish seemed to become spotless, exuding a kind of spiritual immortal qi. Li Yundong was amazed in his heart. He turned his head and began to concentrate on cutting the vegetables in front of him. Ruan Hongling, who was at the door, saw that Li Yundong and Zi Yuan were busy in the kitchen at the same time. They were both immersed in their own work. Occasionally, they would look up at each other, smile at each other, and then pass the knives to each other. Especially when Li Yundong began to cut and stir-fry vegetables, his skilled and delicate knife skills and the way he weighed the pot made Ruan Hongling couldn't help but nod. She thought to herself, this guy also knows a thing or two. I just don't know how the food he makes tastes. The two of them were busy in the kitchen for about 20 minutes. Li Yundong made braised crucian carp, sweet and sour ribs, and tomato egg soup, while Zi Yuan made stir-fried lotus root slices and stir-fried shredded radish. Ruan Hongling looked at the 4 dishes and 1 soup on the table and couldn't help laughing. What a blessing! I haven't eaten hot dishes for a long time. Li Yundong couldn't help asking. Don't you usually eat hot dishes? Zi Yuan smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Ruan Hongling continued. Sister Zi Yuan has already reached the state of fasting. It doesn't matter if she eats or not. As for me, I don't know how to cook for myself, so I have to eat junk food outside all day long. Li Yundong smiled. He picked up a piece of stir-fried lotus root with his chopsticks and chewed it in his mouth. He immediately felt that it was light and tasteless. Not only did it seem that there was no salt in it, but it also seemed that there was no monosodium glutamate in it. Although the taste was bland when it first entered his mouth, Li Yundong almost wanted to spit it out. However, he chewed a few more times out of politeness, and he slowly recalled the unique fragrance of lotus root. The more he chewed, the sweeter it became, as if his lips and teeth were filled with fragrance. Li Yundong couldn't help but praise. Amazing, amazing. I didn't expect you to be so beautiful and have such exquisite cooking skills. This dish seems to have almost no oil, salt, or monosodium glutamate, but it tastes elegant and fragrant. This kind of skill is the skill of a top chef. I can't compare with it. Li Yundong thought to himself, as the saying goes, words are like the person, and writing is like the person. In fact, cooking is the same. Zi Yuan's dishes are so fresh and elegant. It can be seen that she must also be a pure and elegant person. Zi Yuan's smile was very modest and peaceful. She smiled and said, I'm sorry. Ruan Hongling's first bite was of Li Yundong's dish. After only 1 bite, her eyes couldn't help lighting up. She praised loudly. Delicious, delicious. Zi Yuan also reached out her chopsticks and picked up a piece of fish. She tasted it and said with a smile, it's really good. However, she thought to herself, this dish looks, smells, and tastes good, but the taste is a little strong, and the heat is a little rushed. It can be seen that there is still a fire in Li Yundong's heart that has not been extinguished. The more Ruan Hongling ate, the more she praised him. Her cultivation skills were far inferior to Zi Yuan's, so she liked to eat the slightly stronger dishes made by Li Yundong. She ate heartily and couldn't help but praise him while thinking to herself, this guy does have some advantages. I wonder if Sister Zi Yuan will really fall in love with him. Thinking of this, Ruan Hongling couldn't help looking at Li Yundong and Zi Yuan up and down. She saw that one of them was handsome and heroic, exuding a masculine aura from head to toe, while the other had an otherworldly temperament. His every move was full of an ethereal aura that didn't belong to the mortal world. The more Ruan Hongling looked at them, the more she felt that the two of them were really a rare perfect match in the world. She muttered to herself, is the psalm left by Master true? Li Yundong didn't know what she was thinking. He saw Ruan Hongling's eyes constantly rolling around him, so he couldn't help but say, why are you looking at me? I'm not a dish. Ruan Hongling smiled, glanced at Zi Yuan, and said meaningfully, you are indeed not my dish. You are someone else's dish. Under the table, Zi Yuan quietly stepped on Ruan Hongling's foot. Ruan Hongling immediately shouted in an exaggerated manner, Sister Zi Yuan, why did you step on me? Zi Yuan's ears suddenly turned a little red, and she glared at Ruan Hongling angrily. Li Yundong was confused and didn't know what these two beautiful women were doing. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly heard his cell phone ring from the sofa. He walked over to take a look and was shocked. He pressed the answer button with his trembling hand and said in a trembling voice, "Little girl?" Su Chan, who was frightened on the phone, burst into tears when she heard Li Yundong's voice. "Sir, I miss you, /om/." Chapter 168. Go to see Net. Li Yundong suddenly received a call from Su Chan, which was really a pleasant surprise. However, when he suddenly heard Su Chan burst into tears, he suddenly panicked. He walked to the balcony and whispered, "Girl, what's wrong?" "I miss you too." Su Chan was scared at first, but she finally found an opportunity to call Li Yundong's cell phone. She was afraid that no one would answer, and she was also afraid that another woman would answer the phone. While waiting anxiously, the little girl finally heard Li Yundong's familiar and gentle voice. She suddenly couldn't help crying. "Go to see Net." 7K. Oath am. Su Chan sobbed and said, "Master, do you not want me anymore?" Hearing Su Chan's voice, Li Yundong's heart ached a little. The longing that had been suppressed because of the high-intensity cultivation in the past few days was suddenly aroused. He said softly, "Don't be silly. How could I not want you?" Hearing Li Yundong comforting her, Su Chan wiped her tears and said, "There are so many beautiful women around you all day long. Will you fall in love with them?" Li Yundong suddenly felt happy in his heart. He couldn't help laughing and said, "Jealous? Not bad. Didn't you always push me to other beautiful women before?" Su Chan sniffled and choked. "You're so annoying. Answer my question first." Li Yundong smiled and said, "Silly girl, there are so many beautiful women in the world, but I only like you." Su Chan was overjoyed when she heard this. Holding the phone, she couldn't help but smile. "Why?" Li Yundong said softly. "Because the girl has been with me from the beginning." Su Chan giggled when she heard this. She remembered the woman's cold snort when she answered her phone and couldn't help curling her lips. "Then why was there another woman talking on your phone just now?" Li Yundong was stunned. "Another woman? No, I just received your phone call. I just went out to buy vegetables." Su Chan pouted and said, "But there was a woman who answered my call before you." She snorted and hung up. Humph, Li Yundong couldn't help but look back at the living room. Ruan Hongling had been paying attention to Li Yundong. She felt a little guilty in her heart. When she saw Li Yundong looking at her, she immediately avoided his eyes. Watch Net. 7K. Oh. Hong. Only Yundong was not stupid. He immediately understood what was going on. Although he was angry in his heart, he did not show it on the phone. He still said in a soft voice, "It should be someone else who answered the phone." She seemed to have thought of something and asked tentatively, "Yundong, is Zi Yuan teaching you cultivation now?" Li Yundong paused. "How did you know?" Su Chan giggled. "There's nothing I don't know. There's nothing I don't know." Li Yundong laughed and said, "Wow, you're so shameless to blow the conch. Your master must have told you." Su Chan didn't blush. She giggled and said, "My master is so smart." As the little girl spoke, she suddenly rolled her eyes and said, "You went out to buy vegetables just now. Were you cooking for Zi Yuan and the others?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "My girl is also very smart. You got it right on the first try." Su Chan snorted and said sourly, "I want to eat it too. I haven't eaten your food for several days. I'm craving it." Li Yundong laughed and said, Okay, when you come back, I'll cook for you every day." Su Chan was overjoyed. "That's what you said. Pinky swear." The girl's sweet and innocent tone made him feel as if Su Chan was standing right in front of him. She leaned forward slightly, then stretched out her little finger and looked at him with a sweet smile. Her eyes were like two crescent moons when she smiled. Li Yundong couldn't help but become lively and gentle. He subconsciously stretched out his hand, hooked it with his little finger, and said softly, "Pinky swear for 100 years, don't change." Su Chan also said on the phone, "Pinky swear for 100 years, don't change." As they spoke, although both of them were holding their phones, they felt as if the other party was standing right in front of them. Their voices and smiles were lifelike and within reach, and an invisible thread pulled them together tightly. Go to watch net. 7K. Oath M. Net. Super_speed. More. New. Suchan giggled and said, Okay, I believe you. But, Yundong Ziyuan is a powerful figure that my master can't stop praising. You have to learn more from her. She comes from a famous and decent sect, so she is definitely more suitable to teach you than me. Li Yundong smiled and said, But I'd rather you teach me. Suchan giggled and said, Really? Why do I feel like I don't know anything? I'm just making trouble for you. As Suchan said this, she suddenly exclaimed and said anxiously in a low voice, My master is back. I'll hang up first. As she said this, she pressed the phone, then turned around and hid it behind her back. Although Ao Wushuang hadn't seen Suchan make the phone call, she had been through it. When she saw Suchan's guilty look, how could she not understand what a little girl like her was doing? Ao Wushuang smiled and didn't say anything. She walked up to Suchan and spread out her hands. Under the pressure of Ao Wushuang, Suchan didn't dare to resist at all and obediently handed over the phone. Ao Wushuang looked at Suchan with a face full of disappointment and scolded, I've only been out for 2 minutes, and you can't wait to contact your lover. Not bad. You've been out for a few months, and you can even use a mobile phone. Do you really like him or do you really hate him? Suchan lowered her head, and her chin was almost touching her chest. She rubbed the ground with her toes, rubbed the corners of her clothes with both hands, and said pitifully, I like him. Ao Wushuang said angrily, If you like him, then hold back. Don't contact him. Do you want to hurt him? Suchan responded in a low voice, Oh. But after a while, she raised her head timidly and asked weakly, Then master, when can I contact him again? Ao Wushuang snorted and said, Wait until he passes the divine punishment. Oh, Suchan said and lowered her head. After a while, she raised it again and asked weakly, Then master, how do I know when he will pass the divine punishment? Ao Wushuang looked at Suchan speechlessly. You are a three-tailed spiritual fox. Why are you acting like an idiot who has just entered the cultivation world? When the divine punishment comes, how can the cultivation world not know about it? Oh, Suchan said again and lowered her head. But after a while, she raised it again. Just as she was about to speak, she saw Ao Wushuang glaring at her angrily. Suchan was so scared that she quickly lowered her head again. She didn't dare to raise it no matter what, but her eyes were rolling in their sockets. She looked around with shifty eyes, as if she was thinking about something. After a while, Ao Wushuang handed her a train ticket and said, Let's go. I just got the ticket. Suchan took the train ticket, looked at the destination, and said strangely, Master, what are we going to Dongwu City for? Ao Wushuang sighed and said, Why don't you want to make progress at all? How can our Fox Zen school have such a strange person like you? Do you want your lover to leave you far behind in the future? Are you going to leave your cultivation behind? In the end, don't become a burden to him. Suchan suddenly raised her head and asked in surprise, Master, where are you taking me to cultivate? It's a good place for cultivation. Now that you've entered the secular world, I think you won't be able to stop if I take you back to the mountains. You might as well cultivate in Dongwu City. I also have a place to stay there, so you can cultivate in peace. Ao Wushuang nodded and said, Dongwu City is a 1,000-year-old ancient city with deep qi veins, beautiful mountains and clear waters, and a beautiful place for outstanding people. Suchan smiled in surprise and said, Then can I tell Yundong where I'm going first? Ao Wushuang was furious. B****. You're so sentimental. What kind of cultivation do you have? Suchan lowered her head and pouted. She looked unconvinced and muttered, Aren't you the same? Ao Wushuang was immediately defeated by Suchan. She rubbed her temples, sighed helplessly, and said, Save it. When his divine punishment is over, he will naturally know where you are. Suchan blinked her eyes and responded. After a while she asked again, Master. Ao Wushuang was a little crazy. What else? Suchan asked weakly, Why do we have to take the train? Isn't it better to fly? Ao Wushuang pointed to the sky and couldn't help but say angrily, You fool, don't you see that there are so many dark clouds in the sky? It's summer now, when there are the most heavenly thunder. Do you want to fly up and be struck by lightning? Su Chan shrunk her head and mumbled, didn't I forget? Ao Wushuang was so angry that her phoenix eyes widened. Are you deliberately annoying me? Su Chan immediately took Ao Wushuang's arm with a smile and said coquettishly, no, I wouldn't dare. Ao Wushuang loved her disciple very much. Otherwise, she wouldn't have protected her in every way. She would rather risk her life to lead the pursuers away and let Su Chan go alone with the Renyuan Jindan. She couldn't stand the little girl's coquettishness. As soon as Su Chan acted like a spoiled child, the anger in her heart dissipated. Although she still couldn't pull her face down, there was a faint smile in her eyes. Humph, you don't dare? Is there anything you don't dare to do? As she spoke, she shouted, hurry up and pack your things. Follow me quickly. Aren't you afraid of missing the train? Oh, Su Chan said and began to pack her things in a hurry. But after a while she suddenly stopped, turned her head, and said with a groan, Master, I'm hungry. Ao Wushuang threw a plastic bag over and said, let's eat this. Su Chan opened it and was immediately disappointed. Xiaobing? It's still cold. Ao Wushuang said angrily, I made this myself. It's good to have something to eat. You've never been picky before. Do you want to eat it? If not, give it back to me. How could Su Chan be willing to give it back? It was better than nothing. She immediately put on a protective look and took a bite. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound, and a tooth was almost broken by the hot Xiaobing. The little girl let out a cry and covered her cheeks. She thought of the delicious food that Li Yundong had made for her in the past, and then looked at the cold and hard Xiaobing in front of her. She didn't know how many years it had been there. Suddenly, she felt sad. Her eyes were full of tears, and her heart was cold. The more Su Chan thought about it, the sadder she became. She couldn't help curling her lips and saying, it's not as delicious as Yundong's food. Ao Wushuang looked at her and couldn't help laughing out loud. Evil disciple, /OM/. Chapter 169. Go to watch net. After Su Chan hung up the phone, Li Yundong returned to the room and looked back and forth at Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling with an unfriendly expression. Go to watch net. Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling were both cultivators, so they had excellent hearing. They had clearly heard what Li Yundong had said before. Therefore, one of them looked magnanimous, while the other looked sneaky. Li Yundong's heart was as clear as a mirror. Li Yundong's eyes were so sharp that Ruan Hongling couldn't help but slap the table and say, well, stop looking. I answered the phone before. What do you think? Li Yundong said angrily in a deep voice. Why did you answer my call? And why did you hang up with a snort? Ruan Hongling had never been questioned by a boy like this before. She immediately stood up and said loudly, I just don't want to see you abandon yourself and hang out with those evil monsters. Li Yundong saw that not only did she not apologize, but she also said such words. He immediately became furious and said, it's none of your business who I'm with. Please don't meddle in other people's business in the future. Ruan Hongling had been secretly praising Li Yundong in her heart, and her impression of him had greatly improved. But at this time, she suddenly felt that the man in front of her was simply the most hateful person in the world. She couldn't help but say angrily, who wants to meddle in your business? Bah! If it weren't for Sister Zi Yuan, I wouldn't have bothered to talk to you. As she said this, she turned her head and rushed to the balcony, jumping back. Zi Yuan looked helplessly at Li Yundong, who was still angry, and sighed slightly. Why do you have to do this? Li Yundong said angrily, it's fine if I don't settle the score with her for hurting Su Chan. How can she touch my personal belongings? What right does she have to touch my things? Didn't her parents discipline her well? Zi Yuan sighed and said, Hongling's parents died when she was a child. I brought her up. If you want to blame someone, blame me. Although Li Yundong was angry, he still respected Zi Yuan very much. He just turned his head to the side and didn't say anything. Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, although time is still a little tight, if you keep practicing here like this, the effect won't be very good. Why don't you go to Tibet tomorrow? Li Yundong asked in surprise. Why are you going to Tibet? Zi Yuan said with a serious expression. Cultivation. Li Yundong became more and more confused. Why do you have to go to Tibet to cultivate? When cultivators reach the Xueqi phase, they often choose to do so on the mountain. Do you know why? Li Yundong shook his head. I don't know. Watch net. Zi Yuan said, because the mountain is the place where the spirit qi in the world gathers the most. Not only is the air good, but it is also closer to the imperial court of cloud sky, so it is easier to feel the power of the sky and the earth. The higher the mountain, the more it is like this. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat. He could vaguely feel her intentions. He asked tentatively, do you mean that I should go to the Xueqi phase on the mountain in Tibet? Zi Yuan nodded. Times are different now. Basically, the famous mountains have been greatly contaminated by the world, but the mountains in Tibet have not. They are still pure. Therefore you can go there to cultivate your foundation. Li Yundong thought for a while, then sighed and said, that's good, but I don't have the money to go. Zi Yuan smiled and said, why, do you still want to fly over? No, you can run there yourself. Li Yundong was dumbfounded. Run there? You must be joking, right? No, I'm not joking at all. Zi Yuan stopped smiling and said solemnly, although the zhenqi in your body is majestic and strong, it is not condensed. You can take advantage of the journey to slowly temper the zhenqi in your body, especially the first time you run. Don't stop. Run as long as you can until you can't stand it anymore. By the way, bring your fan of 7 treasures with you. Li Yundong thought that he would have to carry the fan of 7 treasures, which weighed more than 50 kilograms, all the way to Tibet. He couldn't help but shiver and stare blankly. Seeing his expression, Zi Yuan was not surprised. She just said softly, if you don't go through the bone-chilling cold, how can you smell the fragrance of plum blossoms? Don't think that cultivation is a very simple thing. It is the most difficult way of heaven in the world, so naturally, it has to go through the most tests. If you feel that you can't hold on, think about the agreement you made with Su Chan. Li Yundong's heart suddenly trembled, and his eyes gradually revealed a firm look. He nodded to Zi Yuan and said, I understand. Where am I going in Tibet? Zi Yuan smiled slightly. Where is the highest in Tibet? Li Yundong said in surprise, you don't mean Mount Everest in the Himalayas, do you? Zi Yuan smiled and said, where else is higher? Li Yundong smiled bitterly. You don't want me to climb to the top of Mount Everest to build the Xueqi phase, do you? I'm afraid I'll freeze to death before I can climb to the top of the mountain. Zi Yuan said, you don't have to reach the top of the mountain. When you climb to a certain level, the zhenqi in your body will have a strong reaction, and then you can start building the Xueqi phase. Go to the internet. 7K. M. I can't tell you the specifics. You're the only one who knows this kind of thing best. Li Yundong took a deep breath and said, I understand. When should I go? Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, you can prepare first. Tomorrow. Li Yundong was stunned. Tomorrow? So soon? Zi Yuan looked at Li Yundong seriously. Do you think there's still a lot of time left for you? Li Yundong didn't say anything. He went back into the room and began to tidy up his clothes. Zi Yuan stood outside the door and watched for a while. Seeing that Li Yundong had sorted out a lot of things and even stuffed his notebook into his bag, she couldn't help saying, just prepare 2 sets of clothes. Don't bring too many things. Just the fan of 7 treasures is enough for you. Li Yundong was stunned for a moment, then began to clear out the things in the bag. He only prepared a few sets of clothes, then he thought for a moment, poured a few bottles of water, and put them in the bag. Li Yundong was busy for a while, and suddenly remembered a very important thing. He only had a few hundred yuan on him. How could it be enough to spend on the way? Zi Yuan seemed to notice what Li Yundong was thinking. She said, are you worried that the travel expenses along the way might not be enough? Li Yundong smiled awkwardly and said, yes, I only have a little money on me. Zi Yuan said, you're not thinking about buying food when you're hungry and finding a hotel to sleep when you're sleepy, are you? Li Yundong couldn't help but ask, are we going to go there on an empty stomach all the way? Sleep when you're sleepy? Zi Yuan didn't answer and asked, do you know how I cultivated back then? Li Yundong shook his head. Zi Yuan said, at that time, I begged alms all the way and walked more than 2,000 miles. When I was hungry, I found food on the ground. When I was thirsty, I drank water from the mountains. When I was sleepy, I found a place to sit down and take a nap. It took me 35 days to reach my destination. Li Yundong couldn't help but look at her in shock. He couldn't imagine how a fairy-like woman like her, who had an otherworldly temperament, could complete this kind of ascetic monk-like cultivation. Zi Yuan said, every year, the Buddhist disciples of the Lamaism have to walk 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers in order to make a pilgrimage. They are much more miserable than us, but there are still countless devout believers who go to the snow mountain every year. Even mortals like them can stand it. As the successor of Jindan's stage, can't you stand it? If you can't stand it, how can you stand it when the divine tribulation comes? When heaven is about to give a person a great responsibility, it must first satisfy his will, tire his muscles and bones, starve his skin, empty his body, and mess up his actions. Therefore, it is necessary to be patient and do what he can't do. Zi Yuan said word by word, her tone unprecedentedly solemn. Don't think that cultivation is the easiest thing in this world just because you've reached the sky in one step. On the contrary, if you haven't experienced real sharpening and you meet a strong opponent in the future, even if your spiritual energy surpasses that of others, it will be easy for your will to be destroyed and defeated, because you haven't experienced real sharpening. Li Yundong suddenly became solemn. He nodded and finally treated this cultivation as the most difficult thing in his life. He first sat down and thought about it carefully, then suddenly stood up and went to the room to find a pair of scissors. Then, he cut open a few pieces of his clothes and wrapped the cut strips of cloth around the fan of 7 treasures. Zi Yuan looked at his movements and nodded secretly. There was a hint of appreciation on her face. By the way, this fan of 7 treasures must not be seen by others. Otherwise, if other cultivators see it, they might be tempted by the treasure and try to snatch it. After Li Yundong wrapped the fan of 7 treasures, he made a strap with a thick strip of cloth and carried it on his back. He walked around the living room, tried to run, and jumped a few times. Then, he took off the fan of 7 treasures and readjusted the length of the strap. When he felt that it could be carried on his back diagonally, he nodded in satisfaction. Zi Yuan watched him walk to the door, squat down, and begin to put on his shoes. She asked in confusion, "You don't want to go out now, do you?" Li Yundong didn't look back, and there was a rare firmness in his voice. "As you said, I don't have much time left. If I delay 1 more second, I will waste 1 more second. Anyway, I've eaten today, so I might as well go out now." As he spoke, Li Yundong had already put on his shoes. He stood up, stamped his feet, and then looked at Zi Yuan. "Is there anything else I should pay attention to?" Zi Yuan thought for a moment and said, "Don't be nosy on the way, especially after entering Tibet. Try not to get in touch with the locals and don't get into disputes with them. Everything is about cultivating the Xueqi phase. When you complete the Xueqi phase, I will come to find you." Li Yundong nodded. He carried his tidied clothes and the fan of 7 treasures on his back. Before he went out, he looked back at Zi Yuan and nodded. "Well, thank you." Zi Yuan smiled slightly. "You don't have to thank me. I'm also doing it for my own cultivation." Li Yundong was stunned, but he didn't have time to think about it. He just said goodbye to Zi Yuan and went out by himself. After leaving Hongqing New Area, Li Yundong immediately ran to the nearest newsstand and bought a map of the whole country and Tiannan City. He looked at the map for a while, confirmed the direction, and then began the long and arduous journey of cultivation. He was carrying a big iron fan that was nearly as tall as a person and wrapped tightly with cloth strips. There was also a bundle hanging on the big iron fan, which looked strange and immediately attracted the attention of the passers-by. Li Yundong felt a little strange under these gazes. He couldn't help but speed up his pace. As he ran, Li Yundong suddenly thought of what Zi Yuan had said to him. "Run all the way, this can temper your zhenqi." Although Li Yundong didn't understand why running could temper his zhenqi, he still did it. In the early summer of June, on the streets of Tiannan City, a young man carrying a heavy luggage was running quickly, attracting the attention of many passers-by along the way. The sun was hanging high in the sky. Li Yundong couldn't help but raise his head and look at the vast sky. This was the first time he had gone so far alone, and it was the first time he had gone to such a far place with 2 legs. He couldn't help but sigh and feel confused. Where was his path? What would this cultivation journey be like? How would he build the Xueqi phase when he reached the Himalayas? He didn't know. He didn't know any of this. The only thing he knew was that if he wanted to know the answer, he could only slowly explore and explore on the journey. This was not only the first long journey in his life, but also the first journey he had embarked on the road of cultivation. No one knew how far this young man would go in order to become stronger. /om/. You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.